Oh, hey guys, come on in. Tonight we're doing something a little different. We begin our journey not with the glorious clash of swords in a climactic battle, or the raucous laughter of a grand banquet, but with something far more intimate, far more personal, and let's be honest, far, far more pungent. Are you ready for this? We are stepping back in time, plunging headfirst into the very personal, very pungent world of medieval hygiene. This isn't just history, my friends. This is an olfactory adventure. We're venturing into a time when people, ordinary people just like you and me, genuinely feared the simple act of bathing more than they feared the ravages of the plague itself. Can you even wrap your mind around that? A time when a clove of garlic wasn't just for seasoning your food, but could quite literally double as a surprisingly potent perfume, and when your next-door neighbor might without a second thought heave the contents of their chamber pot out the window and onto the street below and just call it a normal Tuesday. It was a different world, a different reality, with a completely different set of rules for what was acceptable. So before you get too comfortable in your clean, modern world, please take just a quick moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but truly only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support means the world, but your authentic enjoyment means even more. And hey, I have a question for you. Let me know down in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It is endlessly fascinating to me to see this incredible global community we're building, to picture who's joining us from every corner of the world, sharing this moment together. Now, go ahead, dim the lights in your room, maybe turn on a fan just for that soft, ambient background hum, and let's just ease into tonight's incredible journey together, shall we? Cleanliness is next to godliness. A phrase so familiar to us, so deeply ingrained in our modern psyche, was a concept that would have been met with blank stares and utter confusion in the 14th century. In fact, it was uttered by absolutely no one. Let's shatter a common myth right here and begin with a genuinely surprising fact. In the early Middle Ages, that period just after the fall of Rome, bathing was actually considered a wonderfully good thing. It was healthy, it was social, it was normal. The great monasteries, those bastions of knowledge and order, often had dedicated, well-maintained bathhouses. The ancient Roman traditions of luxurious soaking, of steaming, and of vigorous scrubbing still lingered like a pleasant, clean-smelling ghost in many corners of Europe. People remembered the feeling of being clean, and they liked it. So what on earth happened? What could possibly have changed to turn this fundamental act of self-care into a source of mortal dread? In short, the answer is a toxic cocktail of fear, rampant superstition, and a wildly catastrophically incorrect understanding of how the human body actually worked. People came to believe with every fiber of their being that immersing yourself in hot water was an invitation to disaster. They thought it opened up the pores of your skin, turning your body into a vulnerable, defenseless gateway that allowed illness, pestilence, and all manner of foul miasmas to seep directly into your bloodstream. Just stop and imagine that for a second. Picture yourself living through a terrifying plague outbreak, watching your friends and neighbors fall ill, and thinking with genuine conviction, "I must not bathe. I've just turned myself into a sponge for death." That was the terrifying mindset they were trapped in. Bathing too often, they feared, with a chilling certainty, could weaken your body's natural defenses and actively invite disease to take root. In this warped worldview, water wasn't a cleansing, life-giving force. It was treacherous, deceptive, and potentially lethal. And as if that wasn't enough, it certainly didn't help that the very places designed for bathing the public bathhouses became morally suspicious and shrouded in scandal. By the 13th and 14th centuries, many of these establishments, which were once cherished as places of hygiene and even vital community connection, had devolved into social hubs with a rather scandalous wink-and-a-nudge reputation. Some continued to operate like wholesome, respectable spas, but many others began to function more like clandestine brothels. Predictably, it wasn't long before powerful church leaders began to thunderously associate the simple act of public bathing with rampant sin lust and moral decay. And in medieval Europe, getting the church to label something as sinful was an incredibly effective way to get it shut down for good. So what was the result of all this? Instead of scrubbing down a vast number of medieval folks just stopped. They stopped bathing altogether. And please understand, this wasn't because they loved being dirty or wallowing in filth. It was because staying dry in their minds was seen as the safer, holier, and frankly the much more modest choice. After all, being naked was one thing, a private matter between you and God. But being naked in a tub of hot water with other people, why, that was practically sending the devil a gilded invitation to come on in for a splash. Now, does this mean that everyone simply wandered around looking and smelling like a mud-covered goblin who had just lost a fight with a compost heap? No, not exactly. People still found ways to clean themselves just in bits and pieces. They would diligently wash their hands, their faces, and sometimes their feet using linen cloths dipped in bowls of water, often scented with herbal rinses. But the glorious full-body soak that became an incredibly rare luxury, an indulgence reserved only for the very wealthy, the dangerously brave, or perhaps the terminally itchy. So yes, to put it plainly, medieval people did fear bathing, but it wasn't born from laziness or ignorance, not really. They were trying in their own desperate 14th century way to stay healthy and alive in a world that seemed full of invisible threats. Unfortunately, living without the benefit of germ theory, the convenience of indoor plumbing, or even a basic grasp of microbiology, their strategy was ultimately driven more by crippling paranoia than by effective prevention. Once upon a time, in a fledgling town that didn't yet reek of horse manure, wood smoke, and a general air of regret, the public bathhouse was a shining beacon of civilization. It was a bustling hub of hygiene, a center for health, and a place for some mildly inappropriate, yet mostly harmless social interaction. Can you picture it? Inspired by the still lingering influence of the mighty Roman Empire, these early medieval bathhouses offered the glorious gift of warm water, large communal tubs, and a palpable sense of optimism. These were cherished places where townsfolk, monks, merchants, artisans, and even some of the lower nobles could come to soak away the grime of the week, relax in the steam, and simply chat. It was like a medieval spa day, just minus the fluffy robes, cucumber slices, and scented candles. For a brief, shining moment in time, cleanliness was not only possible, it was downright fashionable. Then things got steamy, but in the absolute worst way possible. By the time the 13th century rolled around, the reputation of the bathhouse had begun to sour. They had acquired a new reputation for, let's just say, multitasking. Suddenly, the act of bathing became less about achieving actual cleanliness and more about seeking companionship. Some bathhouses began offering a host of extra services, complete with attendants who were suspiciously friendly, and water that had quite frankly seen far too many strangers. The line between wellness and wantedness blurred with astonishing speed. What was once a place of health became a den of whispered propositions. Naturally, it didn't take long for the church to get involved, and when they did, they came down hard. Public nudity, even when dutifully paired with a rough loofah, was deeply frowned upon. Sexual misconduct even worse. Soon the very word bathhouse became synonymous with sin disease and public scandal. And then, when the Black Death, the great pestilence, rolled into town like an unstoppable tide of death, people were more than happy to shut them down permanently. The logic was grimly simple. You can't possibly spread the plague through a public tub if that tub has been boarded shut, condemned, and officially declared morally compromised. But it wasn't just sin and sickness that doomed the bathhouse. It was a deeper, more insidious suspicion. Over time, the very act of bathing itself began to seem indulgent, decadent, and even physically dangerous. The simple, pleasant idea of soaking your body in warm water, especially in the company of strangers, felt like a gateway to both physical and spiritual ruin. And so one by one, the bathhouses closed their doors forever. Some were repurposed and turned into bakeries or storehouses. Others were simply abandoned and left to rot, their stone walls crumbling their great tubs, collecting rainwater and leaves. It's a poetic fate, really, for buildings that were originally meant to keep people clean. Meanwhile, cloistered away in their monasteries, monks quietly lamented this loss. Many monastic orders had maintained strict hygienic practices for centuries, including carefully scheduled full-body bathing, but now even that was coming into question under the glare of public opinion. The church wasn't banning hygiene outright, of course not, but they were certainly making it incredibly difficult and socially risky to achieve. And thus began the golden age of dry cleaning, medieval style. Soap became an optional luxury. Water became a suspicious substance, and the beloved bathhouse was relegated to just another forgotten relic of a bygone era, a time when scrubbing your body didn't come with such dire moral and mortal consequences. Despite the church's growing horror at the sight of naked elbows, and the widespread terrifying belief that a hot bath could literally let the plague seep in through your pores, medieval people didn't completely abandon the idea of bathing. How could they? They just transformed it into something you'd do very, very rarely, perhaps once a season, or when the accumulated smell became so powerful it was practically sentient and demanding its own seat at the dinner table. Let's begin with the nobles, shall we? Because, of course, they had it better. Yes, the wealthy and powerful did bathe, though certainly not so often that their imaginary rubber ducks got wrinkly. Their version of a bath was a monumental effort. They had servants who would spend hours arduously lugging massive, heavy cauldrons of boiling water from the kitchen fires up to the private chambers, because remember, indoor plumbing was still a distant fantasy for centuries to come. They would pour this scalding water into a large wooden tub, which was often thoughtfully lined with a clean linen sheet to prevent splinters. Then they'd sprinkle the water with fragrant herbs like lavender, sage, chamomile, or whatever was growing nearby that didn't smell like feet. This wasn't so much a bath as it was a human soup you happened to be sitting in. The entire production was often set up right in the bedroom, or near a massive fireplace for warmth, with privacy being entirely optional depending on your level of power or shamelessness. Some high-ranking nobles even shared the tub with their spouse, because really what could possibly be more romantic than floating together in each other's filth like a kind of medieval fondue? The poor bathed too. Of course they did, but their experience was a world away. They usually made do with icy rivers, streams, or large barrels, basically anything that held water and didn't bite back. For them, it wasn't about hygiene. It was about sheer efficiency. The thought, might as well wash the kid the shirt and the goat all at once, was probably uttered more than once, and with complete seriousness. In the brutal cold of winter, bathing took a back seat to the more pressing matter of simple survival. So instead of soap and water, people turned to a different strategy. One we might call pretend you're clean and just keep walking. A few urban bathhouses did manage to survive this dark age of hygiene, particularly in the warmer climates of southern Europe, where a lingering Roman influence and better access to water kept the dream of cleanliness alive. These were sometimes very well-run establishments, complete with steam rooms and herbal treatments that felt incredibly luxurious. Other times, let's be honest, they doubled as venues for certain extracurricular activities that were definitely not approved by the Vatican. Either way, you probably left feeling refreshed, mildly steamed, and possibly slightly judged. And for truly special occasions like childbirth or a miraculous recovery from the plague, people would get proper ceremonial baths, because nothing says, "Welcome to the world, little one," or "Please, for the love of God, don't die," quite like being ceremoniously dipped in a barrel of tepid rosemary water. When the act of full-body immersion became so deeply suspect, thanks to the paralyzing belief that hot water invited disease like an open bar at a wedding the medieval world had to adapt, they turned to the next best thing, the humble, unassuming sponge bath. Except they didn't really have sponges, at least not the soft, yellow, mass-produced kind you can buy at any modern store. What did they use instead? They used simple linen cloths soaked in a bit of warm water, perhaps with some herbs or a splash of vinegar for its deodorizing properties, and they would wipe themselves down with all the care of someone trying to buff a stubborn stain off a very delicate, very important chair. Hygiene, in this context, meant dabbing. It was a localized, targeted affair. If you were lucky and had a loving family, someone else might do it for you. If you were a noble, a servant almost certainly did it for you, probably reluctantly. These crucial partial washes focused on the most essential areas: hands, face, armpits, and occasionally the feet, the high-traffic zones of the body, so to speak. A secret weapon in this fight against filth was their underlayers of clothing. The linen shirts and shifts worn by men and women alike were brilliant at absorbing sweat and grime from the skin. This meant that simply changing your shirt regularly was about as close to modern hygiene as you were likely going to get. Your outer tunic may have been a bit crusty, but your undershirt, that was fresh. Of course, nobody was fooling themselves into thinking this was the same as a proper, thorough cleaning. But in a world where clean water was a limited and precious resource, or if you genuinely believed a real bath might be a fatal invitation to the Black Death, this was the safe, sensible bet. And in a world utterly devoid of deodorant toothpaste or daily showers, a simple cloth soaked in rose water or sharp vinegar was the absolute medieval equivalent of a luxurious spa day minus the spa and really minus the day. For the wealthier folks, this process was an attended ritual. Servants might gently heat the water over a brazier mix in fragrant herbs like rosemary or marjoram, known for their cleansing properties, and then gently wash their master or mistress while trying their very best to pretend they weren't judging them. Peasants, on the other hand, would boil a pot of water over their hearth fire, then ladle it out into wooden bowls, and do the same for themselves and their children, perhaps, without the subtle judgment, but definitely with a lot more draft. And if you happened to be a monk, you probably had a better and more consistent routine than most. Many monastic orders had strict rules that required scheduled washing of the hands and face, even if the primary purpose was more spiritual than sanitary. Either way, for nobleman, peasant, and monk alike, the end result was essentially the same: a quick, targeted rub-down, a whisper of moisture on the skin, and a renewed, if fleeting, sense of being just clean enough to not scare the livestock. So no. It wasn't glamorous, was it? It wasn't even truly clean by our standards. But it worked more or less. At least until you had to ride a horse for 6 hours straight through thick mud. Then all bets were off. Oh, let's talk about hair, shall we? If medieval hair had a personal motto, something whispered from root to tip, it would probably be flammable, but fragrant. What a combination right now. Contrary to the popular mud-caked image we have in our minds, people didn't just wander around with matted, tangled bird nests perched on their heads, at least not intentionally. That was not the goal, I promise you. They did, in fact, wash their hair. They just didn't do it frequently, and they certainly didn't do it with anything even remotely resembling the glorious, sudsy, beautifully scented shampoo we take for granted today. Can you even imagine your life without that simple bottle in your shower? The very idea was an impossible dream. So what in God's name did they use? What was their secret? Well, it was a wild variety of strange, home-brewed concoctions that sounded like they were pulled directly from the first draft of a witch's spellbook. I'm not kidding. A very popular choice, especially for cutting through layers of grime and grease, was a brutally effective lye soap, which was made from collected wood ash and rendered animal fat. Does that sound harsh? Because it was. This stuff was absolutely fantastic for cutting through grease, but it was also fantastic at cutting through your scalp if you dared to use it too often. Just picture the raw, stinging sensation pair that caustic substance with a bucket of water of dubious quality, and what you've got yourself is a full-blown medieval chemical peel. For those poor souls hoping to preserve their precious hair follicles a little longer, a gentler, though infinitely messier alternative was sometimes used egg yolks. And yes, you have to truly let this image sink in. That meant sitting in a drafty, freezing hut, shivering with the cold, slimy texture of raw eggs slowly sliding down your neck and back, all while desperately trying to convince yourself that this was a nourishing, luxurious beauty treatment. The things we do for beauty, right? Others, perhaps, after giving up on the egg treatment, would rinse their hair with beer. Why beer? Well, if nothing else, it certainly made you smell like you'd just had a wildly successful night out at the tavern, even if you were just a humble peasant desperately trying to remove a stubborn lice infestation. And the quest for clean hair didn't stop there. Some of the more sophisticated hair washing recipes included vinegar infusions, often scented with herbs like rosemary or lavender, which cleverly did double duty. First, they helped to cover up the myriad of other unfortunate smells clinging to a person, and second, they gave the distinct illusion of dedicated self-care. But let's be crystal clear about the process here. No one, absolutely no one, was lathering up, rinsing, and repeating. This was so much more of a targeted splash and squeeze operation. It was about damage control, not indulgence. Water temperature also mattered immensely, and not for comfort, but out of sheer terror. Hot water, it was widely believed, could actually weaken the brain, leaving you confused or feeble-minded. Can you imagine that fear? That a simple wash could rob you of your wits? On the other end of the spectrum, ice-cold water was thought to give you the plague. So lukewarm was the precarious sweet spot, the only safe option, assuming you had enough precious fuel to heat the water in the first place, and didn't mind waiting 3 long hours for a single bucket of bath water that your grubby older sibling hadn't already used. Brushing, on the other hand, was a different story entirely. Thank goodness it was routine. It was cherished. It was a small island of normalcy in a sea of hygienic chaos. Combs made from bone wood or polished animal horn were incredibly common personal items and were often elaborately and beautifully carved. Can you see it? A moment of true artistry and elegance in an otherwise relentlessly itchy reality. And people, especially women, took immense pride in long, healthy, well-kept hair. It was a primary symbol of beauty and status. Noble women in particular might spend hours upon hours getting their long tresses painstakingly braided, intricately coiled, and then modestly hidden beneath a delicate veil, all while fervently hoping that a nearby fireplace didn't undo all of their hard work with one single rogue spark. What a terrifying thought. Now, let's move on to a topic that will make you want to go brush your teeth immediately. Dental care in medieval Europe was less about achieving a sparkling white smile and more about boasting, "I still have most of my teeth. What's your excuse?" It was a world of lowered expectations. Now, to give them some credit where it's due, medieval people didn't entirely ignore their oral hygiene. They didn't exactly understand the science behind it either, not in the way we do, but they made a truly solid effort using what they had available to them, which for the most part was bits of cloth charcoal powder and a whole lot of blind hope. There were absolutely no toothbrushes. Not a single one. That revolutionary innovation was still centuries away from being invented. So what did they do instead? People used simple linen rags, often the corner of their shirt, or a scrap of fabric to vigorously rub their teeth clean. This cloth would ideally be soaked in something abrasive to help scrub away the grime. Things like coarse salt, crushed mint leaves, or even the ash of burnt rosemary. The primary goal wasn't whitening, it was sheer survival. It was about preventing the agony of a rotten tooth. If your breath didn't physically knock someone over from 5 paces away, you were already winning the game of life. Some people opted for a more natural solution, chewing sticks. These were thin twigs broken from specific trees like hazel or elm, which were then frayed at one end to create a crude, brush-like effect. You'd just chew on the end until the wood fibers separated, and then you'd scrub away at your teeth. Think of it as the original biodegradable toothbrush. It was organic, it was fully compostable, and it was weirdly, unavoidably bark-flavored. And what about fresh breath? This was a huge concern. To freshen their breath before a close conversation, people would chew on aromatic seeds and spices like fennel seeds, whole cloves, or cardamom pods, depending entirely on what they could afford, or, let's be honest, what they could pilfer from the kitchen spice rack. In the wealthier circles of society, you might even rinse your mouth with sharp vinegar, a robust red wine, or even myrrh-infused water. Yes, myrrh. Nothing says dental sophistication quite like gargling with a fluid that was also famously used to embalm Egyptian pharaohs, right? And if you're sitting there wondering about toothpaste, well, it did sort of exist in a terrifyingly gritty form. Some surviving recipes call for powdered charcoal, crushed eggshells, and the fine ash of oyster shells, all mixed with a little honey or oil to form a thick, abrasive, pitch-black paste. I mean, can you even imagine putting that in your mouth? If your mouth didn't feel any cleaner afterward, it at least felt thoroughly sandblasted. Now we have to talk about the dentists. And I use that term very, very loosely. If you could even call them that, they were usually the local barbers on their off days, or perhaps a blacksmith with a steady hand. If a tooth was loose, horribly infected, or just generally annoying you, the solution was brutally simple: yank it out. That was it. No anesthetic, no numbing agents, no questions asked. Just you, a sturdy wooden chair, the barber's terrifyingly strong grip, and a few desperate mumbled words to God. The aftercare. It usually consisted of rinsing with wine for the supposed antiseptic properties, and hoping with all your might that your soul peacefully left your body before a raging infection set in. But despite all this horror, medieval people weren't necessarily a toothless bunch. Isn't that shocking? Their diets were significantly lower in the processed sugars that plague us today, and as a result, many rural folks actually had better overall dental health than many modern snackers. But when rot did manage to set in, boy, it set in fast, and with a vengeance. And the only toothpaste strong enough to fix it at that point was divine intervention. Let's just be brutally honest for a moment. If you could snap your fingers and time travel to a bustling medieval town square, your very first reaction would not be awe at the architecture. It wouldn't be wonder at the historical spectacle. Your first reaction would be gagging. It would be a desperate physical struggle not to vomit. Because medieval Europe smelled. It was committed to its smell. It was deeply, unforgettably committed to being an olfactory assault. There was no functioning sewage system, no concept of deodorant, and very, very few functioning bathtubs, which meant that the average street smelled like a nightmarish combination of human sweat, animal waste, rotting food, wood smoke, and a faint, desperate hint of misplaced optimism. If your nose managed to survive a simple trip through the fish market and past the noxious fumes of the tanner's shop, then congratulations, you'd already done better than most modern tourists would. So how on earth did people deal with this constant, overwhelming olfactory chaos? How did they not go insane? Well, they got incredibly creative. Enter the pomander, a true lifesaver for the medieval nose. This was a small, often beautifully crafted hollow ball, usually made of silver or gold for the rich, which was filled with a potent mixture of fragrant herbs and spices. It was worn on a chain around the neck or tucked discreetly into clothing like a kind of medieval Glade plug-in. These little treasures were stuffed with pungent things like cloves, cinnamon, dried lavender, or animal-derived musk. And they were often dipped in precious ambergris, which is essentially fancy whale barf. But let's not dwell on that to make them smell even more pleasant and last longer. Think of it as carrying around your own tiny portable air filter, only it didn't actually purify anything at all. It just politely and desperately overpowered the surrounding filth with a better smell. Ladies of the era often wore scented sachets tucked away inside their bodices, a clever trick that served a dual purpose. It helped to mask their own body odor, while also helping to ward off the overwhelming smell of others. Some women even braided fragrant herbs like rosemary or marjoram directly into their hair. Can you see the ingenuity? It was a strategy that was equal parts hygiene, high fashion, and a kind of spiritual pest control. For those with enough coin, true perfume was a magnificent luxury imported from the exotic Middle East or Italy. These were potent oils made from rose jasmine, or even civet, a substance extracted from the rear end of a very surprised and very unhappy cat-like animal. Applying it involved a delicate process of dabbing, waving a scented cloth, and pretending with all your might that you weren't just covering up the lingering stench of boiled turnips and existential regret. And then, of course, there were the inescapable environmental smells, the stench of open sewers running down the middle of the street, the ever-present odor of livestock living cheek by jowl with people, the thick haze of candle and wood smoke, and the smell of whatever the local butcher had just unceremoniously flung into the street. Entire cities were often enveloped in a palpable, visible fog of funk. But here's the crazy part. No one really complained because everyone was trapped in the exact same nasal nightmare together. It was a form of communal suffering with strong notes of garlic and despair. The church constantly encouraged spiritual cleanliness, of course, but your physical scent was left largely to chance and personal ingenuity. If you happened to smell decent, people would naturally assume you were either incredibly rich or possibly a saint. If you didn't, well, then you were just blending in perfectly. If you have ever even for a single day forgotten to wear deodorant and spent the entire day nervously and discreetly checking your armpits like a suspicious criminal on the run, just try for a moment to imagine doing that for your entire life. Now imagine that no one had ever invented deodorant. And absolutely everyone, smelled like they'd just been jousting in a heavy wool tunic for 3 days straight. Welcome, my friends, to the Middle Ages, where body odor wasn't just a remote possibility. It was an identity. It was a fact of life. There were no roll-ons, no aerosol sprays, and certainly no clinical-strength aluminum-based antiperspirants. People simply sweated, and then they had to make peace with it. Sort of. To mask, or at least manage the pervasive musk, people employed a variety of clever little tricks. One very common method was using alum powder, a naturally occurring mineral salt that has mild antibacterial and astringent properties. It didn't stop the sweat, but it could in theory cut down on the resulting stench, assuming you remembered to apply it, and you didn't mind the strange sensation of grinding rocks into your pits every morning. Others used fine chalk dust vinegar rinses or poultices of crushed herbs. Sage mint and rosemary were particularly popular, not because they were miraculously effective antiperspirants, but simply because they smelled like something better than you did. The logic was heartbreakingly simple. If you can't stop the sweat, then at least try to smell like a salad. In fact, perfumed handkerchiefs became all the rage among the nobility mostly, so they could hold them delicately under their noses while trying to navigate the crowded, reeking streets. It was a small act of self-preservation. No one wants to smell like medieval stew meat, but realistically, everyone did. The absolute best you could hope for was to smell like floral stew meat. Medieval medicine also played its unfortunate part in this smelly saga. Tragically, physicians of the time believed that sweating was a healthy and necessary way for the body to purge itself of bad humors and toxins. Therefore, trying to block your sweat was seen as suspicious, unhealthy, and possibly even dangerous. Can you believe it? You were actively expected to sweat, to stink, and to let the body cleanse itself. In their eyes, you weren't unclean. You were just medically fragrant. Then you have to consider the fashion problem. People wore layers upon layers of heavy wool, thick linen, and sometimes fur, which trapped heat and moisture against the body, like a personal mobile greenhouse. Combine that suffocating wardrobe with the heat from open fires, the exertion of daily life, the feasting, and the occasional terrifying outbreak of plague, and you had yourself a full-blown sensory experience worthy of an immediate city-wide evacuation. But hey, here's the comforting thought: you weren't alone in your misery. Everyone around you smelled, even the king, even the priests, even the woman selling you radishes at the market, who probably hadn't bathed since Epiphany. In short, deodorant wasn't real. But shared suffering, that absolutely was. In a world without showers, without soaps that didn't maim you, and without any deodorant that didn't involve stuffing herbs into your armpit and hoping for the best, medieval people turned to a completely unlikely hero in their daily hygiene routine linen. Not to eat off of, but to wear preferably as close to the body as possible, and changed long before it could grow legs and walk away on its own. Linen undergarments were the true unsung saviors of the Middle Ages. They were the silent guardians of medieval society. This incredible fabric was breathable, it was highly absorbent, and it was surprisingly durable. These simple garments were worn beneath the heavier, more expensive, and practically unwashable outer layers of wool and fur. Simple linen shirts, chemises for women, and shifts for sleeping soaked up the sweat. The grime, the oil, and everything else the human body so enthusiastically produced in a world that celebrated moisture but completely misunderstood soap. The logic behind it was actually quite elegant and brilliant. Wash the linen, not the person. Why? Because scrubbing your own body was considered risky and dangerous. Remember the fear of the plague. But scrubbing your shirt in a boiling pot of water was perfectly safe. As a result, people might go weeks, even months, without a full bath. But they would diligently change their linen underlayer, sometimes even twice a week if they could afford it, which by medieval standards was practically saintly behavior. Linen was so deeply respected that having clean linen became a powerful status signal. If your shirt peeking out at the collar and cuffs was white and relatively clean, people would immediately assume you had your life together. You were a person of substance. If it was gray, crusty, and sprouting a bit of mold, well, then you were either desperately poor, possibly possessed by a demon, or perhaps recently resurrected. For women, the long linen shift worn under their gowns was absolutely essential. It protected their valuable outer garments from being stained by sweat, and perhaps even more importantly from absorbing the smell of that sweat. It was the medieval version of Febreze, only far less chemical and infinitely more judgmental if it wasn't properly maintained. Knights wore linen under their heavy armor to avoid literally turning into baked ham during a hot tournament. Monks wore it under their coarse woolen habits. Even the poorest peasants wore simple linen tunics, though theirs were usually heavily patched, worn threadbare, and held together by little more than sheer willpower and stubbornness. Of course, we have to acknowledge that washing all this linen wasn't fun. Are you kidding me? It was a grueling, back-breaking chore that involved hauling and boiling water using harsh lye soap, violently beating the fabric on rocks by a riverbank, and praying the whole time that the current didn't sweep your only clean shirt away. But even that monumental effort was still considered easier and safer than bathing yourself or dealing with the terrifying spiritual consequences of baring your chest to a tub of suspiciously warm water. And if there was one single thing that was truly universally consistent in the medieval hygiene routine, from the highest king to the lowliest beggar, it was itching. Constant, maddening itching. And it wasn't because people were allergic to linen or hay, though. Let's be honest, it was probably that too. No. The primary reason for the endless scratching was that they were constantly unwillingly playing host to an entire traveling circus of lice, fleas, and mites. Lice were such an unbelievably common everyday nuisance that they were basically treated like unwanted, persistent roommates. You didn't get lice. You just had lice. It was a permanent state of being. Everyone did. The rich, the poor, the pious, the drunk. Lice did not discriminate. They were the true, profound equalizers of medieval society. So what in the world did people do about this constant infestation? Well, for starters, they combed. And combed, and combed. Lice combs, often intricately carved from bone or wood, were common personal items. Much like a toothbrush is for us today, except instead of polishing your teeth, you were painstakingly raking tiny bugs out of your scalp, like you were harvesting some kind of tiny, screaming orchard. These combs had incredibly fine, closely packed teeth that were specifically designed to pull out the vile little critters, their eggs known as nits, and most of your remaining patients along with them. Another surprisingly effective method was boiling their clothes or baking them near an open fire. The intense heat could kill the lice, assuming, of course, that you didn't accidentally burn your only tunic in the process. This is also why you might see medieval illustrations of people holding up their shirts near a flickering flame. It wasn't laundry day. It was pest execution day. And then, of course, there was the classic, time-honored technique of simply shaving one's head. Particularly among monks who already practiced tonsure, or anyone who could get away with a bald look. Removing all the hair was a brutally effective, if somewhat dramatic, solution. Sometimes a wig was worn on top, which, ironically, could become its own 5-star lice hotel if it wasn't cleaned properly. Still, the logic was devastatingly clear: no hair, no home for the vermin. Fleas were a whole other nightmare, especially for anyone sleeping on straw-stuffed mattresses or living in close quarters with animals. There were no flea collars for the dog, no bug sprays for the house. The best they could do was smoke fumigation and tossing sachets of strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or pennyroyal between the sheets. Some believed certain smells actively repelled the pests. Others probably just hoped the fleas would get annoyed and move on to someone smellier next door. But the real solution, the only true solution, was simple, grim endurance. Everyone itched. Everyone scratched. It was just a non-negotiable part of life, as certain as taxes, death, or stepping in something truly unspeakable near the market stalls. What a world, my friends. Take a deep breath of your clean, modern air, because we are about to plunge into one of the most fraught and fascinating topics of the medieval world. The medieval toilet. What a phrase. A term that feels so wildly, so beautifully optimistic, it's almost poetic. Because in all honesty, the act of going to the bathroom in the Middle Ages was far less about comfort, privacy, or sanitation, and much, much more about creative improvisation, a cast-iron stomach, and the art of dramatically lowered expectations. Are you ready for this? Let's start at the top, shall we? With the elite, the lords and ladies of the great stone castles. They had garde-robes, a wonderfully quaint French term that literally means wardrobe, probably because they were often built into the thick castle walls right next to where they stored their clothes, a choice that seems baffling until you realize it was a desperate attempt to let the ammonia from the waste pit below kill moths. Isn't that just a perfect medieval solution? In reality, these garde-robes were basically small, cold stone closets furnished with a simple stone or wooden bench. In that bench was a hole, a direct portal, that dropped straight down sometimes into the castle's murky moat, sometimes into a purpose-dug cesspit below, and occasionally, horrifyingly, into an unfortunate patch of earth that some poor soul forgot to fence off. Can you just imagine the sheer audacity of it? These were often located high, high up in the castle towers, not just for privacy, but for the added undeniable thrill of gravity doing all the work. It was an engineering marvel of terrifying simplicity. And if you happened to be a guard, a servant, or just a visitor loitering below one of these chutes, you learned very, very quickly not to linger. The faintest sound from above was your cue to run for your life. The peasants, on the other hand, who made up the vast majority of the population, had far fewer, if any, such luxuries. Where did they go? Most of them simply did their business outside in the quiet solitude of the woods, near the ever-flowing river, or discreetly behind the barn. Out of sight, out of mind. Some villages, in a remarkable display of civic planning, had communal pits. These were essentially giant open-air outhouses with extraordinarily low standards and even lower levels of privacy. Just picture it, your neighbor might be in there mid-squat trying to have a serious conversation with you about crop yields or the price of wool. There was a distinct lack of personal space that would be utterly unthinkable to us today. But what about for those urgent nighttime needs? For this, the humble chamber pot was the undisputed star of the show. These portable ceramic or metal pots were a household essential tucked conveniently under beds or beside sleeping pallets, always ready to receive. well contributions in the dead of night. If you have never had the distinct pleasure of fumbling around in the pitch-black darkness, trying to relieve yourself into a cold, unforgiving ceramic bowl just inches away from your sleeping family, then congratulations, you are definitively not medieval. Imagine the skill required. The terror of missing. The quiet sloshing sound in the otherwise silent room. It's a sensory experience we are blessed to have been spared. And what you must be wondering, did they do with the collected contents of said pots come morning? Well, this is where it gets truly iconic. They threw them out the window. Literally. The contents were unceremoniously hurled into the street below, often accompanied by a hearty warning shout of "Garde à l'eau," which over time became the anglicized "Garde l'eau," meaning "watch out for the water." What a wonderfully polite euphemism. Residents would dump their household waste directly into the street, ideally not hitting any innocent passers-by. But let's face it, in the early morning rush, accuracy wasn't always guaranteed, was it? The monumental task of street sanitation was handled mostly by the forces of gravity, the occasional rainstorm, and an army of wandering pigs, who were in effect the world's first and most enthusiastic sanitation department. Some more advanced cities had open gutters or central ditches called kennels, meant to carry the waste away, though these often clogged, overflowed in the rain, or just sat there fermenting in the sun until they became a permanent, pungent neighborhood feature. And toilet paper. Oh, you sweet summer child. Not quite. That was a luxury beyond their wildest dreams. For personal cleaning, people used whatever was free and available. This meant handfuls of rags, if you were lucky, soft moss, scratchy straw, or in a pinch, just their hands. And for the truly refined, perhaps some leftover bits of wool or linen scraps from the mending basket. If all of that sounds deeply unpleasant, just try to imagine using a handful of snow in the dead of winter, because they absolutely did that. The sheer shocking cold of it. What a testament to human resilience. Now, before the entire continent collectively decided that bathing was a deeply suspicious activity, and probably a mortal sin, public bathhouses were actually thriving in medieval Europe. They were everywhere, and these weren't just simple rooms with tubs and soap. Oh no, they were the vibrant, steamy social hotspots of their day. I want you to think of them as sprawling medieval spas, but with a few extra very juicy plot twists. Can you picture the scene? The air thick with steam, the sound of splashing water and boisterous laughter echoing off the walls. It was a place of true community. These bustling bathhouses offered a glorious variety of services. You could get a piping hot bath, relax in a steam room, get a vigorous massage, and enjoy food, wine, and even music. And depending on the specific establishment, you might also find the occasional very questionable companionship for hire. At their absolute best, they were revolutionary communal wellness centers, places where people from all walks of life could come together to get clean and socialize. At their worst, they were bare-kneed, rowdy dens of delicious gossip, shameless gluttony, and light scandal. And sometimes you could experience all three before noon. They were commonly called stews, not because you sat in one for too long, like a piece of meat in a broth, although you certainly might, but because of the clouds of hot, billowing steam that filled them. Believe it or not, mixed-gender bathing wasn't unheard of, especially in places like Germany or Italy, where societal attitudes were a little bit more relaxed. And it wasn't always as risque as it sounds. Whole families could attend a bathhouse together for a weekend soak. Even monks sometimes bathed in pairs for efficiency, but human nature being what it is, Boundaries inevitably got a little murky. And so my friends did the water. Naturally, all of this commotion made the bathhouses a favorite and frequent target for the church. Stern-faced clerics thundered from their pulpits, warning their flocks that bathing in mixed company was a slippery slope that led directly to sin, which, to be perfectly fair, it often did. Over time, some bathhouses subtly, or not so subtly, became little more than brothels with very good plumbing. The waters got hot, and it wasn't just from the roaring fire beneath the tub. Then came the plagues, and everything, absolutely everything, changed. When terrifying diseases like the Black Death swept across Europe like a scythe, the beloved bathhouses were swiftly blamed. The leading doctors of the day, operating without any knowledge of germs, believed that disease entered the body through open pores in the skin. And since a nice warm bath was known to open the pores, well, the grim math added up in a "we don't know about germs, but this sounds plausible" sort of way. It was a death sentence for the bathhouse. They were shut down by civic order, their reputations utterly tanked, and suddenly the simple pleasure of a public bath was out permanently. It was now seen as a death trap. Some regions, of course, held on to the tradition a bit longer. The warmer climates of southern Europe, the Middle East, and certain bustling port cities kept their stews boiling for decades, more defying the new wave of hygienic paranoia. But in most of northern and central Europe, the bathhouses began to vanish faster than your dignity after slipping on a slick tile in a communal tub. What remained was a confusing mix of fond nostalgia and crippling fear. People remembered the bathhouses as warm, lively, joyful places, but now they'd also become potent symbols of sin disease and dangerously damp decision-making. By the 1500s, the average person wasn't soaking with strangers anymore. No, they were back in their cold, drafty homes, miserably dabbing at their armpits with a vinegar-soaked rag and praying for the miraculous invention of a soap that didn't smell faintly of goat. And that brings us to the soap itself. Soap in the Middle Ages was a lot like the medicine of the time. It was harsh, it was highly experimental, and it was very likely to make you question all of your life choices. It technically worked, yes, but using it felt so much more like a punishment than an act of self-care. It was a necessary evil. The most common recipe was a hearty, no-nonsense blend of rendered animal fat and lye. Or, if you want to sound particularly fancy, you could call it rendered tallow and wood ash. When these two humble ingredients were combined through a long, smelly process, they created a caustic substance that could strip dirt oil grime and possibly your very soul from any surface it touched. Early soap didn't come in pleasant pastel-colored bars with delicate scents, like ocean breeze or spring meadow. Oh no. It came in coarse, waxy, brownish lumps that looked like something you would actively avoid stepping in on the street. To make this stuff, you needed a great deal of patience and an incredibly strong stomach. Can you imagine the process? You'd have to boil down huge vats of sheep or pig fat, a process that would fill the air with a thick, greasy smell. Then you'd stir in the alkaline ash water and wait for hours as the foul mixture slowly saponified and hardened into rough blocks. If you were feeling particularly artisanal, you could add some dried herbs like lavender, rosemary, or mint, which might help you convince yourself that you were creating something special. But mostly it just smelled like a damp campfire that was burning something deeply disappointing. This brutal soap was mainly used for doing laundry and for other heavy-duty scrubbing tasks, not so much for washing the human body, at least not casually. Skin was considered a delicate thing, and this potent lye soap could easily turn a pleasant bath into the experience of a mild chemical burn. Still, people did use it when absolutely necessary, especially before very special events like a wedding, an important court appearance, or ironically, during a plague outbreak when they were desperate to get clean. Far more refined and gentler soaps did exist, but they came from the Islamic world and from southern Europe. The most famous of these was Castile soap from Spain, which was revolutionary because it was made with olive oil instead of animal fat, making it far, far gentler on the skin. These beautiful pale soaps were coveted luxury goods traded across the Mediterranean and reserved for the very wealthy people who didn't already smell like a goat on a daily basis and wanted to keep it that way. But for most folks, for the vast majority of the population, soap was a utility, not a pleasure. It was a tool. You used it to wash your precious linens, your wooden dishes, and maybe your hands, but only if they were truly deeply offensive. It was certainly not part of a daily hygiene ritual. It was more like a monthly or seasonal event, like paying your taxes or witnessing a full moon. Some people went their entire lives with only minimal exposure to soap and considered themselves perfectly fine. Thank you very much. Especially when they were surrounded by countless others doing the exact same thing. Communal odor, you see, has a remarkable way of setting the bar incredibly low. And the laundry. Oh, in medieval Europe, doing the laundry wasn't just another household chore. It was a full-body workout, a major community event, and a dangerous flirtation with frostbite in the winter. Forget about your modern laundromats or your quiet, efficient washing machines. If you wanted clean clothes in the Middle Ages, you had to be willing to boil them, beat them senseless, and beg the heavens for the weather to cooperate. Most laundry, as we've learned, was done in rivers. This sounds so picturesque, doesn't it? Like a charming painting. Until you remember that these same rivers also served as the town's sewer, the local livestock bath, and the occasional body disposal site. But hey, running water is running water, right? First, you would soak your precious linen garments in a solution of lye or get ready for this urine. Yes, actual human urine collected in pots and stored for weeks until it reached its peak chemical potency. This delightful substance was known as chamber lye. It was highly valued for its high ammonia content, which was brilliant at lifting stains and whitening fabric. The smell, well, the smell was decidedly less helpful. But in a time when perfume was an optional luxury and hygiene was largely interpretive, it did the trick. After a good long soak, the clothes were dragged to the river, scrubbed vigorously against rough wooden boards or large flat stones, and then pounded mercilessly with heavy wooden paddles. This method was known as fulling. It was less of a gentle wash cycle and more of a clothes interrogation. This brutal back-breaking process could take hours and often involved the collective gossiping effort of the town's washerwomen, who were both feared and admired for their incredible arm strength and sharp tongues. Then came the rinsing and the wringing, and finally the drying, which, if it suddenly started to rain, meant you had to wait another day and hope your only clean shirt didn't develop a new and horrifying form of sentience. Clothes were often spread across thorny bushes and hedges, or stretched on lines strung between trees and humble peasant huts. For much of the year, medieval villages had the charming, chaotic aesthetic of a never-ending yard sale. Of course, not everyone had to endure this themselves. The very wealthy households had dedicated laundry servants the monasteries had lay brothers to do the monks' washing, and some larger towns even had professional washers who would do the job for a fee. But for most ordinary people, it was DIY, or die. And what's so fascinating is that having clean clothes was often seen as far more important than having a clean body. You might not have bathed in a month, but if your linen shift peeking out from your tunic was bright white and fresh-smelling, relatively speaking, you were considered perfectly presentable. In many cases, your laundry was your hygiene. After all this, after 14 chapters of scratching, scrubbing, sniffing, and surviving, the ultimate question must finally be asked. Did medieval hygiene actually work, or was everyone just one unwashed tunic away from spontaneous combustion? What is the final verdict? The short answer is this: it worked well enough. No, not by our ridiculously high modern standards, of course not. If you were to time travel back to the year 1347, your 21st century nostrils would probably file for divorce from the rest of your face. But in their own context, operating within their own reality, medieval folks weren't completely oblivious to the concept of cleanliness. They simply operated on a dramatically different scale of what counted as clean. They had their own systems, even if those systems involved bizarre vinegar foot soaks and the previously mentioned chamber pots being hurled out of windows. They had their own tools. They had their fine-toothed lice combs, their life-saving layers of linen, their vinegar, their herbs, and their brutally effective ash-based soap. They had their rituals, too. Whether it was a quick sponge bath before Sunday Mass or the seasonal boiling of one's underwear on a full moon, hygiene absolutely existed. It was just deeply, inextricably interwoven with crippling fear, unwavering religious faith, and the ever-unpredictable weather. In so many ways, medieval people were truly doing the very best they could with the knowledge and the resources they had, all while constantly trying not to anger God, the local baron, or their own aggressively pungent armpits. The idea of taking a regular full-body bath was not only risky and incredibly time-consuming, but thanks to the doctrines of the Church and the terrifying fears of the plague, it was seen as medically unwise. It was a fool's errand. So what did they do? They got inventive. They adapted. They survived. And surprisingly, some of their practices have aged remarkably well. Their reliance on linen undergarments was, from a hygienic standpoint, absolutely brilliant, using herb-infused water and vinegar rinses. That's pretty solid antibacterial logic even today. Even their beloved communal bathhouses were remarkably effective sanitation centers until they devolved into steamy hot tubs of gossip and syphilis. But yes, let's not romanticize it too much. People smelled, they scratched constantly, they shared baths, lice, and some deeply, deeply misinformed medical advice. And yet, despite all of these hygiene horrors that would send us screaming for the nearest bottle of hand sanitizer, many of them lived to see old age, or at the very least a second harvest. So while their standards of cleanliness were, let's just say, fluid, they were not without effort. Hygiene was simply more of a social signal than it was a science. Clean clothes were a sign of virtue and good standing. Shiny hair, or at least less itchy hair, was a sign of discipline. And simply avoiding full-body rot was considered good manners. In the end, medieval hygiene worked in the same way that balancing a broken wagon wheel with a piece of twine works barely precariously, but rather impressively, considering the tools they had to work with. Now, hold on. After that deep, deep dive into the grime and grit of medieval Europe, I want you to clear your mind. Forget the chamber pots and the lye soap for a moment. Let's travel even further back in time to a place that will shatter every single assumption you might have about the primitive, ancient world. Imagine walking through a city over 4,000 years old, the ancient shining jewel of the Indus Valley civilization. If you were expecting a random collection of dusty mud huts and chaotic winding alleyways, think again. This place, Mohenjo-Daro, was so impossibly, so brilliantly well planned that it could make a modern city planner weep with pure, unadulterated envy. Constructed around 2500 BCE, Mohenjo-Daro wasn't just thrown together like a haphazard festival campsite. Are you kidding me? It was meticulously, breathtakingly organized. The entire city was laid out in a grid pattern. Yes, you heard that right. Actual city blocks and perfect right angles thousands of years before the Romans. The streets ran in straight lines from north to south and from east to west, intersecting cleanly and forming a neat, orderly network of roads. It was as if the ancient architects had used a giant ruler and said, "Let's keep this geometric, shall we? Let's have some order." But the real magic, the part that will truly blow your mind, wasn't just on the surface. It was what lay underneath those dusty, sun-baked roads. It was a system that even some 21st century cities often fail to properly maintain a comprehensive drainage system. Mohenjo-Daro had an underground sewer system. Can you believe it? Almost every single house, no matter how small or humble, had access to both fresh water and drainage. Wastewater flowed from private bathrooms in the homes into covered brick-lined drains that ran alongside the main streets. You could almost hear the ancient residents saying, "Yes, actually, sanitation matters a great deal to us." The contrast with medieval Europe is just staggering. The city wasn't just a giant bathroom with bricks, though. It was zoned with incredible intention. There was a raised citadel built on a high mound of earth, which was likely home to the city's administrative or religious elites. Below it was the sprawling lower city where the general population lived and worked. Magnificent public buildings, like the famed and enormous Great Bath, suggest that life here wasn't just about survival. There was ritual, there was community, and maybe even recreation soaked right into the very clay of the bricks. Markets likely thrived along the main thoroughfares, and the houses varied in size, indicating a clear social stratification. But here is the most astonishing part. Even the most modest homes had their own private wells and their own indoor toilets. Let that sink in for a moment. People with fewer means still had access to indoor plumbing 4.5 millennia ago. Meanwhile, many wealthy 19th century Europeans were still just throwing their waste out of their windows. And then a profound mystery. The city was eventually abandoned. There is no sign of a great battle or conquest. No evidence of a dramatic fire. Just silence. Perhaps it was climate shifts that altered the course of the river. Perhaps it was a disruption of their trade networks. But whatever the cause, the incredible legacy of Mohenjo-Daro endures a city built with breathtaking intent, stunning intelligence, and a disturbing awareness that clean water and zoning laws actually matter. And they didn't even have an urban planning department. Go figure. Now, if Mohenjo-Daro was the tidy, brilliant, and practical accountant of ancient cities, then Babylon was its theatrical, glamorous celebrity sibling. It was flashy, it was vast, and it was drenched in myth and legend. Babylon wasn't just a city. It was a symbol of power and ambition. It rose and fell many times over the centuries, but in its absolute prime, around the 6th century BCE, under the reign of the legendary King Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon was the glittering, vibrant heart of Mesopotamia. Now don't let all the poetry and myth fool you. This place was just as carefully planned as it was majestic. Babylon was a massive walled city with enormous fortified gates. The most famous of these, of course, was the Ishtar Gate, a towering marvel adorned with dazzling cobalt blue glazed tiles and decorated with reliefs of sacred lions, dragons, and bulls that looked like they belonged in a fever dream. And no, this gate wasn't just decorative. It was a critical part of a carefully orchestrated and deeply symbolic urban layout. At the very center of Babylon's design was a sacred axis, a grand processional way that ran in a straight, awe-inspiring line right through the city. This wasn't just a road. It was a parade route for the gods themselves, literally. During major religious events like the Akitu New Year festival, enormous statues of the gods would be paraded along this very street, linking the great Etemenanki ziggurat, the colossal structure that may or may not have inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, to the mighty temple dedicated to the chief god Marduk. Urban planning here was part piety and part pure propaganda. You didn't just live in Babylon, you walked its holy narrative every single day. Babylon's streets curved elegantly with the Euphrates River and obeyed the natural contours of the land, but they were also zoned with remarkable intelligence. There were distinct residential quarters, sprawling temple complexes, legendary gardens, bustling markets, and fortified administrative centers. The mighty Euphrates River sliced right through the city, providing not only a source of water, but also a navigable artery for trade commerce, and let's be honest, for showing off the city's wealth and power. Drainage systems were certainly present, though perhaps not quite as refined and comprehensive as those in the Indus Valley. Still, homes had bathrooms with clay pipes and canals to move wastewater away from living quarters. Babylonian engineers were clearly not amateurs. In a fantastic display of royal ego, even the baked bricks used in the construction of the canals and sewers bore inscriptions of the king's name, because if you're going to build sewers, you might as well brand them. Babylon was a city that was fundamentally designed to impress both mortals and gods. Every street, every towering gate, every gleaming temple was a powerful statement. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and marvel at the fact that we got all the zoning permits approved. And people did marvel. Even Alexander the Great centuries later reportedly planned to make Babylon the capital of his new empire. Because really, once you've walked down a street that was literally built for a god, a place like Athens probably felt a bit underwhelming. And now, my friends, we journey to a place so monumental, so utterly breathtaking in its design, that when a later civilization stumbled upon its ruins, they could only conclude that it had been built by gods. Roughly 1,000 years before the mighty Aztecs would gaze in wonder at its crumbling pyramids and give it the name we use today, Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born. This ancient Mexican city was already flexing its urban design skills on a scale that is difficult to comprehend even now. What kind of a place inspires such a name? What must it have felt like to walk its avenues when it was alive? At its absolute peak, around 500 CE, Teotihuacan was one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the entire world, home to a teeming population that was well north of 100,000 people. And unlike the chaotic, suffocating sprawl of so many modern megacities, this place was deliberately, meticulously, and breathtakingly mapped out with the kind of mind-bending precision you'd expect from a sacred geometry student who never once forgot their protractor. This was order on a divine scale. What is the city's most iconic feature? It has to be the legendary Avenue of the Dead. Now, despite its morbid, rather spooky name, we have the Aztecs to thank for that it was less of a cemetery, and so much more of a grand ceremonial boulevard, a magnificent stone river that stretched for over 2 miles through the heart of the city. And this grand avenue was absolutely no accident of geography. Can you even imagine the vision it took to create it? It was a central axis, a cosmic artery aligned with powerful astronomical events and flanked on both sides by towering temples, sweeping public plazas, luxurious residences for the elite, and bustling, vibrant market zones. It was the spine of the city connecting the majestic Pyramid of the Moon at its northern terminus with the absolutely enormous Pyramid of the Sun further down, creating a sacred backbone that structured and gave meaning to the entire urban landscape. To walk this avenue must not have felt like a simple commute. It must have felt like a pilgrimage. Now hold on, because here's where things get even more advanced, even more mind-boggling. Teotihuacan's entire layout was orthogonal. What does that mean? It means the whole city. This massive metropolis followed a strict grid system that was intentionally tilted about 15.5 degrees off of true north. Why? Why would they do that? It was almost certainly done to align the entire city with specific celestial phenomena, perhaps the rising of a particular star, or to orient it towards the sacred mountains that surrounded the valley. This wasn't a random choice. It was deeply, profoundly cosmological. This was urban planning with a cosmic compass, a divine mandate written across the very land itself. What did they see in the stars that we have forgotten? And what about zoning? Oh, you'd better believe they had zoning. Residential compounds. The apartment blocks of their day were laid out in neat, modular blocks, often housing multiple families who all had access to shared patios, internal courtyards, and surprisingly sophisticated drainage systems. Some of these compounds were highly decorated with stunning murals indicating the wealth of their occupants, while others showed a more communal working-class lifestyle. This wasn't just a city. It was an organized, stratified society, made visible in stone and brilliant stucco. The very structure of their homes told you who they were. Teotihuacan also had an incredibly complex water management system that would have made a Roman engineer nod in appreciation. A network of canals and drains ran alongside the streets, and through the residential zones, a brilliant piece of engineering designed to help prevent flooding during the heavy rainy season. The engineers who built this place clearly understood their environment intimately and planned for it with incredible foresight. You just get the sense that these people would have been deeply, personally offended by the mere existence of potholes. It would have violated their very sense of order. There is still so much we don't know about this incredible place. Who ruled them? How was their power structured without the traditional kingly monuments we see elsewhere? But we do know this for certain. The city was built to impress both the eyes of mortals and the all-seeing eyes of the skies. Teotihuacan was a living blueprint of order, a place that masterfully combined sacred ritual with cold, hard rationality. And when the Aztecs, those fierce warriors, stumbled upon its towering, silent ruins, centuries later, they didn't just admire it. They assumed that only gods could have possibly built it. And honestly, after seeing the impossible symmetry, the cosmic alignments, and the sheer scale of the place, who on earth could blame them? When we talk about ancient urban planning, it's so tempting to imagine a single brilliant mastermind, doesn't it? The ancient version of a celebrity city architect, standing on a hill with a rolled-up scroll and a grand, singular vision. But in the incredible Indus Valley civilization, it seems that the meticulous planning came not from a single ruler's decree, but from something far more profound and mysterious, a cultural consensus so powerful, so deeply ingrained, that multiple cities spread across a vast region, from Harappa to Mohenjo-Daro to Lothal, all share shockingly similar features. I want you to really think about that. These weren't just sister cities. They were practically architectural clones. And that says something so incredibly profound about who these people were. Imagine traveling for hundreds of miles across the plains only to arrive in a new city and find it laid out almost exactly like the one you just left. The uniformity is staggering. Take the city of Harappa, for example, located in what is now modern-day Pakistan. Just like its famous sibling Mohenjo-daro, it too was laid out in a precise, grid-like pattern. It featured uniform, standardized brick sizes, clear zoning for industrial, residential, and administrative use, and you guessed it, incredibly advanced drainage and sanitation systems. Each and every home, from the largest to the most humble, was connected to the covered street drains via private chutes or underground terracotta pipes. This wasn't just a matter of sanitation. It was a statement. It was dignity by design, a system that ensured that even the most common citizens had access to clean and private facilities. What a revolutionary concept. Then you have Lothal, another major Indus city located near the Arabian Sea, which added a whole new layer of breathtaking sophistication to the mix port planning. Yes, you read that right. Lothal had a massive, brilliantly engineered dockyard, quite possibly the earliest known in the entire world, complete with a colossal basin and ingenious sluice gates designed to control the water levels. This wasn't just some sleepy riverside outpost. This was a major international shipping hub with an infrastructure that anticipated tides, currents, and seasonal flow patterns. And you thought Venice was clever? Lothal was doing this thousands of years earlier. But what makes all of this even more remarkable, even more mystifying, is what is absent. There is no evidence of kings. There are no grand palaces, no mighty military fortresses, no monumental statues of ruling elites, no epic inscriptions boasting about glorious battlefield victories. None of the typical trappings of power we see in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Instead, these incredible cities seem to have been run by efficient, perhaps anonymous bureaucracies or councils that were intensely focused on practical matters like hygiene, trade, and ritual. Their power, it seems, came from engineering, not from empire. Their authority was built on sewer pipes and standardized weights, not on swords and crowns. Artifacts like those perfectly standardized weights and measures found across hundreds of miles suggest a deeply and meticulously regulated economy with designated market areas and specialized craft zones. You can almost imagine the ancient planning committees, can't you picture them arguing over the optimal placement of a warehouse or debating the necessary width of a new sewer line? Because these decisions were clearly made, and they stuck, creating a uniformity that spanned an entire civilization. And they weren't just building for the elite. The consistency in home construction, the universal access to water, and the proliferation of public amenities like baths and wells all point to an urban ideal that was collective, not hierarchical. The real architects of the Indus Valley cities weren't just building towns. They were shaping a society where order was embedded in every single brick, and where meticulous planning wasn't a privilege reserved for the rich. It was a principle. When we think of the word zoning today, our minds probably conjure up images of grumpy bureaucrats in a drab city hall arguing over parking permits and whether someone's new Airbnb violates residential codes. But zoning, the simple, brilliant act of dividing a city into designated areas for living, for working, for worshiping, and for dumping your garbage, isn't a modern invention. Not even close. It's an ancient practice, and it was surprisingly, shockingly widespread. Cities like Mohenjo-daro, Babylon, and Teotihuacan weren't just random chaotic clusters of buildings that grew up by chance. They were carefully orchestrated, deeply intentional spaces, and each one had a powerful logic behind its layout. Let's start with our old friend Mohenjo-daro again. There, as we know, the raised citadel housed the important public buildings, the Great Bath, the massive granaries, and possibly the administrative centers. Below it in the lower city lay the residential quarters, with broad, straight avenues separating them into neat blocks, and the workshops, the noisy kilns for firing pottery. They were kept to the edges of the city, probably because absolutely nobody wanted their home filled with smoke and the constant deafening clang of pottery wheels. It's zoning born of pure common sense. But the truly impressive part is that this exact model was repeated across numerous Indus cities. It was a shared blueprint for a good society. Now let's jump over to Babylon. Babylonian zoning, as we've seen, was driven not just by utility, but also by powerful forces of ritual and propaganda. The grand temples and the opulent palaces completely dominated the city's heart, linked together by those magnificent ceremonial routes designed for the gods. The administrative buildings and the homes of the elite were clustered nearby, basking in the glow of power, while the commoners and the bustling markets were pushed further outward. But everyone from the richest noble to the poorest farmer lived under the same overarching city layout. Philosophy, it was organized, it was purposeful, and it was impressively breathtakingly sophisticated. And then there's Teotihuacan. Here, zoning reached a level of almost surgical precision. It's just astounding. The city's layout followed that strict cosmically aligned grid, but each sector within that grid had its own clear and distinct identity. There were the residential compounds, the specialized craft production zones, the massive market areas, and the awe-inspiring temple complexes, all coordinated like the different parts of a single living body. And get this, some of the residential compounds even housed immigrants. Archaeologists have found entire neighborhoods of people from the Oaxaca region or the Gulf Coast, with each neighborhood built in the distinct architectural style of their distant homeland. It was zoning plus multiculturalism in 500 CE. Can you believe that this incredible level of spatial organization shows one absolutely critical thing? These weren't just cities. They were intentional societies. The urban space was a direct reflection of their values, whether those values were spiritual, political, or economic. Where you lived, where you worked, and where you worshipped, these were all pre-mapped by people who understood not only how humans move through a space, but also how they relate to one another within it. And no, they didn't need any modern GIS software to do it, just keen observation, brilliant engineering, and maybe a divine mandate or two. Because when a society can enforce complex zoning laws without a single Twitter outrage or a flurry of lawsuits, you know their urban planning game was light years ahead of its time. We just love to imagine the ancient world as being gloriously, romantically filthy, don't we? We picture muddy streets, the constant hurling of chamber pots, and the unmistakable perfume of unwashed crowds. But the truth, the shocking truth, is that some ancient cities cared a great deal about sanitation. In fact, several of them had public hygiene systems that would make a 19th century Londoner blush with shame. After everything we've discussed about the medieval world, this is going to feel like science fiction. Let's return one more time to Mohenjo-Daro, our undeniable sanitation superstar. It's almost impossible to overstate their achievements. Nearly every single house, regardless of its size, had its own private bathing area, often complete with a carefully sloped floor to drain the water away. And where did that wastewater go? It was channeled into covered street drains. Yes, covered. These drains were lined with perfectly fitted bricks and even equipped with access holes and manhole covers for cleaning and maintenance. The drains ran along nearly every street in the city, efficiently carrying waste away from the residential areas. It was for all intents and purposes an early version of municipal plumbing. This was not just clever. It was revolutionary, a profound statement about the value of public health. Now compare that to Babylon, where hygiene was perhaps a bit more symbolic. The city did have canals, and some drainage channels, and elaborate clay pipes carried fresh water into the palaces and temples. But for the average citizen, sanitation likely involved household cesspits, open ditches, and a healthy amount of divine forgiveness. Still, bathrooms were common, and the wealthier homes did have a form of indoor plumbing using clay piping. Some ancient records even describe what sounds like a rudimentary flushing system, likely involving servants, strategically placed buckets, and very good timing. Now let's zoom back into Teotihuacan. Though perhaps not as utterly obsessed with drainage as the cities of the Indus Valley, Teotihuacan still featured carefully engineered stormwater canals, and in the elite compounds, separate sewage systems. Many of the multifamily residential complexes had their own internal drains, and the major public buildings often had designated latrines for public use. Here, cleanliness wasn't just about physical comfort. It was likely deeply tied to concepts of religious purity, especially in the most sacred ritual areas, like the temples or along the Avenue of the Mya. Even the smaller cities in the ancient world, places like Lothal and Harappa, reflect this deep understanding of hydrology. They built wells reservoirs and strategically sloped streets, all designed to prevent flooding and manage water resources. Can you just imagine planning an entire town with the forces of gravity and the timing of seasonal monsoons in mind, and then pulling it off flawlessly in 2400 BCE? What makes all of this so incredibly impressive isn't just the technology itself, it's the mindset behind it. These ancient civilizations viewed water not just as a daily necessity, but as something to be channeled, shared, respected, and managed for the collective good. Hygiene wasn't a luxury reserved for the elite. It was embedded into the very fabric of the urban design itself. Modern cities still struggle mightily with waste management and crumbling infrastructure. These ancients, they were already out there digging trenches and laying bricks, quietly reminding us across the millennia that the simple act of flushing is a profound civilizational achievement. If the temples were the places where ancient people spoke to their gods, then the markets were where they negotiated with each other and most likely argued vociferously over the price of onions. Every single one of the ancient cities we've explored so far had a powerful beating economic heart. And that heart pulsed with vibrant life in the form of carefully planned marketplaces, bustling trade routes, and intelligent economic zoning. In Babylon, for example, markets were not some chaotic afterthought squeezed in between the temples. Not at all. They were institutionalized, woven directly into the urban grid, and strictly regulated by law. The famous Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest and most complete legal texts known to humanity, devotes dozens and dozens of clauses to trade practices, weights and measures, and the proper behavior of merchants. Can you imagine? The markets bustled with activity under shady porticos and in large open-air squares. Grains, textiles, wine, slaves, and livestock all changed hands, while an army of scribes sat nearby, diligently tracking debts and transactions on clay tablets. This wasn't just casual shopping. This was commerce with a robust legal infrastructure. Now shift your focus to Teotihuacan, where things get even more fascinating. The city hosted absolutely enormous market plazas, especially near the massive citadel complex, where literally thousands of people would gather to trade. What were they trading? everything obsidian tools, precious cacao beans, iridescent feathers, beautiful ceramics, and valuable salt. And unlike the highly centralized, temple-controlled economies of some other cultures, Teotihuacan's market system appeared to be remarkably decentralized and community-driven, with different neighborhoods specializing in the production of specific crafts. You can think of it as an ancient version of a city full of local Etsy shops, except your supplier lived in the compound next door. Meanwhile, back in Mohenjo-Daro and the other Indus Valley sites, archaeologists have uncovered caches of perfectly standardized weights and delicately balanced scales, suggesting a robust and fair system of economic regulation. Goods from as far away as Mesopotamia, including cylinder seals and precious stones, have been found in the ruins of Indus sites, indicating that long-distance international trade was a regular thing. Just imagine your local neighborhood fishmonger accepting Mesopotamian currency without even blinking. But it wasn't just about the money, was it? It never is. The markets were powerful social hubs. In Babylon, they were the places to catch up on the latest gossip, to have disputes settled, and to see who was wearing the latest fashionable Assyrian tunic. In Teotihuacan, they were multicultural melting pots, with traders and travelers from distant lands mingling together in the shadows of the Great Pyramids. Even the Indus cities, which so conspicuously lacked grand palaces or temples, always prioritized their economic zones in their urban design. Trade drove innovation. It demanded roads, regulation, and records. And the ancient urban planners responded not with chaos, but with structure. Because you can be sure that behind every sacred temple or mighty fortress wall, there was a merchant yelling, "Best price in the city, I'm practically giving it away." And finally, we must understand that in the ancient world, urban planning wasn't just about sewage systems and shopping districts. More than anything, it was about the gods. The temples weren't hidden away in quiet corners of the city. No, they dominated the skylines. They sat atop the city's highest points and demanded the absolute prime real estate. If the markets were the city's heartbeat, then the temples were its very soul, and the ancient planners made absolutely sure that everyone knew it. Let's start with Babylon. The skyline was completely pierced by the Etemenanki ziggurat, a multi-tiered man-made mountain of baked brick dedicated to the city's patron god, Marduk. This was no modest shrine. It was an architectural flex of epic proportions, measuring around 91 meters high, if ancient sources are to be believed. It was designed to be a literal stairway to heaven, a structure meant to bridge the gap between the earthly realm and the divine. And this wasn't just a spiritual idea, it was centralized urban messaging. All roads led to the temple. All major ceremonies revolved around it, and the entire city, both architecturally and ritually, bowed to its divine core. Teotihuacan, too, placed its spiritual heart front and center. The Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon weren't just ceremonial structures. They were the city's urban anchors, and the Avenue of the Dead connected these two colossal temples like a celestial path on Earth, aligning with astronomical events and possibly even the solstices. Everything else, from the residential compounds to the market spaces, seemed to radiate outward from these sacred monuments. They weren't just background props. They were the cosmic coordinates that guided both the foot traffic of the people and the philosophy of the civilization. And then there's the beautiful enigma of Mohenjo-Daro. It didn't have towering ziggurats or pyramids, but instead it gave us the sublime Great Bath, a large, meticulously engineered public water tank that was almost certainly used for ritual purification. This was not just a swimming hole, it was a masterpiece engineered with watertight bricks, a sophisticated drain system, and was likely linked to profound spiritual practices of cleanliness, ritual purity, and rebirth. There were no idol-lined sanctuaries here, just the silent, powerful trinity of water geometry and awe. In all of these magnificent cities, the sacred spaces were deliberately placed and functionally integrated into the life of the city. The temples were never isolated. They were connected to processional roads, to public courtyards, and to the administrative centers. Worship wasn't separate from life. It was life. And the urban planning reflected this fundamental unity. These were not secular societies that just happened to have temples. They were sacred landscapes disguised as cities. Every single brick laid, every street carved, every plaza placed was part of a larger, magnificent spiritual choreography. Because in the ancient world, to build a city was to make an offering, and you can be damn sure that the gods always got the best seat in the house. It's so tempting, isn't it? It's tempting to think of our modern cities with their gleaming towers of steel and glass, their intricate subway maps, and their complex power grids as purely products of recent innovation, of blueprints, born from civil engineering degrees. But if you dig a little deeper, I mean literally dig, you'll find that the very bones of urban life, the foundational DNA of what makes a city work, were laid down thousands and thousands of years ago by brilliant planners who had no access to concrete, no bulldozers, and certainly no KD software. The fundamental principles of city planning, the elegant logic of grids, the common sense of zoning, the life-saving necessity of sanitation, the unifying power of civic centers, and the soul-shaping placement of religious spaces, all of it was already etched into the earth by people we so often and so foolishly underestimate. Just take drainage, for instance. Mohenjo-Daro didn't just throw down a few open ditches and call it a day. Are you kidding me? They designed and built an integrated multi-level wastewater system that ran through individual homes and flowed into covered channels beneath the streets. This concept, the revolutionary idea of universal access to sanitation, is something that is still tragically elusive in many parts of the modern world, yet it was a non-negotiable standard in this magnificent Bronze Age metropolis. Can you even comprehend that then there's Babylon, which laid the groundwork not just for regulated commerce and civic infrastructure, but for the powerful symbolic use of space to reinforce the authority of both kings and gods? And Teotihuacan, that breathtaking city, gave us the very template of the cosmic city, a place where every single road, every plaza, and every towering temple was designed to point to something bigger, something grander than the human eye could see on its own. Its visionary builders connected the science of astronomy to the art of architecture, embedding the silent, majestic rhythms of the cosmos into the everyday movement of its people. Believe me, these weren't just settlements. They were philosophical blueprints brought to life in stone. And then there's the incredibly powerful psychological aspect of it all. Ancient cities were designed to influence behavior. The wide, straight avenues didn't just allow for traffic. They were built for grand processions and military parades that filled the citizens with a sense of collective pride and power. The enclosed private courtyards within residential blocks didn't just provide light and air. They created intimate communal spaces where families could connect and neighborhoods could form. Zoning wasn't just a practical tool for keeping the noisy workshops away from the houses. It shaped how people interacted, how social hierarchies were visualized, and how authority was made manifest. These ancient, brilliant design choices told people where to gather what was sacred, and how to live in harmony with one another, or at least how to try. Every bit of modern urban planning owes an immense debt to this ancient foresight. The rigid grids of Manhattan. They echo the logic of Harappa and Teotihuacan, the intricate canal and sanitation systems of Amsterdam. They are a modern reflection of Mohenjo-Daro's genius. The very idea of our cathedrals and town halls occupying a central, important space that comes directly from these ancestral cityscapes where temples and civic buildings formed the undeniable core. We still measure property. We still design our cities around the fundamental needs of access, trade, spirituality, and spectacle. What's truly changed is the technology we use, not the underlying principle. And so while we pave our superhighways and erect our dizzying skyscrapers, the ancient foundational core remains. Cities are and always have been stories that we write in stone, in brick, and now in steel. And the very first chapters of that epic ongoing story, they were carved with simple copper tools. They were planned with meticulously drawn star charts, and they were sustained by people who understood with a clarity that is humbling that good living requires good planning. So the next time you walk down a city street, any city street, take a moment. Remember that you're not just moving through space. You're walking through 4,000 years of brilliant ideas, a conversation across millennia quietly whispering to you from beneath your feet. And now let us leap forward in time to an empire that learned many of these lessons well. Let us talk about a man who would become the master builder of his age, the Emperor Hadrian. He was not born in the glittering marble heart of Rome, but on its distant, sun-drenched western fringe. He came into the world in the year 76 CE in a town called Italica, a thoroughly Romanized outpost in the province of Hispania Baetica, a land we now know as southern Spain. Though he was geographically far from the capital, a boy from the province's Hadrian's family was anything but provincial. They were wealthy, they were elite, and they were profoundly ambition-drivenly Roman in their culture. But most importantly, his father's side of the family was related by blood to Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, the very man who would one day become the mighty Emperor Trajan. Life dealt young Hadrian a cruel blow early on. He lost both of his parents at around the tender age of 10, a formative and heartbreaking tragedy that thrust him directly into the guardianship of two of the most powerful men in the empire, his relative Trajan and a man named Publius Acilius Attianus, a high-ranking Roman knight. Can you imagine being an orphaned boy with those two giants, shaping the entire trajectory of your life? While so many other young nobles of his station were relentlessly steered toward glorious military careers or the cutthroat world of politics, Hadrian gravitated toward something different. His soul was drawn to Greek literature, to philosophy, and to the arts. He spoke Greek with the fluency of a native. He read Homer obsessively, and he much preferred the quiet company of a scroll to the cold weight of a sword, at least in his early years. But Rome, of course, didn't run on poetry, and so Hadrian, as all ambitious Roman aristocrats were forced to do, had to earn his place and prove his worth through dedicated service. He began his career as a military tribune, serving first in Lower Moesia, then in Upper Moesia, and finally in Pannonia. He proved himself to be a competent and capable officer, certainly, but his deeper, more formidable talents lay in the arts of administration and statecraft. Trajan's incredible rise to the emperorship in 98 CE marked a seismic turning point for Hadrian. Though their personal relationship was sometimes known to be strained, Hadrian had a reputation for being sharp-tongued, intellectually arrogant, and a bit too much of a high-minded intellectual for some of the gruff military men. Trajan nonetheless kept him close, recognizing his immense talent. Hadrian steadily climbed the cursus honorum, Rome's rigid ladder of political advancement, becoming a quaestor, then a tribune of the plebs. He also married exceptionally well. His bride was Vibia Sabina, who was Trajan's own grandniece. This was a politically strategic union of the highest order, a move designed to solidify his place in the imperial family, though by all accounts it was not a happy one. The marriage was likely loveless, formal, and distant, as Hadrian's personal interests and deepest affections leaned more toward intense philosophical companionship and male intimacy, especially in the later famous case of his beloved Antinous. Hadrian's early life was therefore defined by this powerful, ever-present tension between the expectations of a Roman military man and the temperament of a Greek artist. He was a man from the very edge of the empire, yet he was destined to lead it not through the application of brute force, but through a unique brand of calculated grace. In a world obsessed with conquest, he was already dreaming of marble columns, balanced proportions, and profound philosophical dialogue. When the great Emperor Trajan fell gravely ill in the year 117 CE, the pressing question of his succession became urgent, chaotic, and dangerously murky. Though Hadrian had long served in the imperial orbit and was the clear frontrunner, in many ways his claim to the throne was far from universally accepted. Why? Because Trajan had never publicly and officially named a successor, and the powerful political elite in Rome were deeply divided over whether Hadrian, this aloof, brilliant, and sometimes arrogant intellectual from Hispania, was truly the right man to lead the Roman Empire. Trajan died in the city of Selinus in Asia Minor, far, far from the capital. Then something happened that would forever shadow Hadrian's reign. Conveniently, or perhaps suspiciously, within days of the emperor's death, a letter arrived in Rome. This letter stated that the dying Trajan had officially adopted Hadrian as his son on his deathbed, a final act supposedly witnessed by Trajan's powerful wife, Plotina, and the ever-loyal guardian Attianus. The timing was just a little too perfect, wasn't it? Some senators immediately whispered of forgery. Others suspected that the Empress Plotina, a known admirer of Hadrian, had orchestrated the entire affair, favoring Hadrian's sharp administrative mind over the more militaristic and expansionist candidates. Regardless of the shadowy circumstances, the Senate ratified Hadrian's accession, and he officially became emperor on August 11th, 117 CE. But the transition was anything but smooth. It was a baptism by fire. Almost immediately, Hadrian faced a monumental crisis. The empire had become dangerously overextended under Trajan's relentless military campaigns, particularly in the east in Mesopotamia, where rebellion was already brewing. Rather than continuing this policy of aggressive, endless expansion, Hadrian made the pragmatic but deeply unpopular choice to withdraw. He pulled Rome's legions back from Trajan's newest eastern conquests, including Armenia and Mesopotamia. This act absolutely infuriated many of the senators and military men who had bled and sacrificed for those very victories. Hadrian was immediately accused of cowardice, of weakness, even of betrayal. And then came the bloodbath. Shortly after his ascension, 4 prominent and powerful senators who had openly opposed Hadrian's rise to power were suddenly arrested and executed under vague charges of conspiracy. It was a swift and brutal consolidation of power. Hadrian publicly and vehemently denied any involvement, instead blaming the executions on his old guardian Attianus. But very few people in Rome believed him. This single bloody act would permanently taint his relationship with the Senate for the rest of his life, even as he tried to govern with restraint and a deep respect for the law. The message, however, was crystal clear. Hadrian could philosophize like a Greek, but he would not hesitate to rule like a Roman. Despite all this political turbulence, Hadrian's first acts as emperor clearly revealed his true priorities. He canceled massive amounts of public debt, he distributed money to the poor, and he secured the loyalty of the military with generous donatives. He made a powerful symbolic break from the cycle of endless conquest and began the monumental task of refocusing Rome's immense energy inward on consolidation, on infrastructure, and on long-term stability. Hadrian may have come to power through whispered corridors and shadowy signatures, but once he wore the imperial purple, he wasted absolutely no time in making the vast Roman Empire his own. Hadrian was never ever content to rule from the cool comfort of marble halls in Rome. Unlike most emperors before him, he saw the empire not as some distant abstraction on a map, but as a living, breathing, sprawling landscape, and he was absolutely determined to walk it. From the very moment he secured his throne, Hadrian set out on a revolutionary mission to visit nearly every single province under his control. And this was no mere ceremonial tour. It was hands-on governance. It was military inspection. It was architectural correction. It was high-stakes diplomacy. And it was visionary leadership all wrapped up in a pair of sandals and a whole lot of sweat. Over the next 2 decades, Hadrian would log more miles, see more of his empire, and connect with more of his subjects than any emperor before or after him. His first major tour began in 121 CE and lasted for nearly 5 incredible years. He traveled through Gaul, Germania, Britannia, his native Hispania, Africa, the Balkans, Greece, and Asia Minor. And he didn't do it by lounging in a comfortable chariot. He often traveled on foot, marching alongside his soldiers, sharing their rations and their hardships. It was part brilliant leadership and part breathtaking spectacle. It was in Britannia that Hadrian witnessed firsthand the dangerous instability along Rome's northern frontier. The Caledonian tribes, the future Scots, were relentless and fierce. Rome, he realized, had pushed too far, so Hadrian opted to pull back and fortify. The result of this decision was his most famous and enduring legacy, Hadrian's Wall, a colossal 73-mile-long stone barrier that stretched from coast to coast across northern England. But this wasn't just a military installation. It was a profound psychological statement. It was a declaration of limits. Rome under Hadrian would defend what it had not reached endlessly and greedily for more. In Africa, he inspected the desert fortresses and addressed critical infrastructure needs. In Asia Minor, he funded the construction of public works and magnificent temples. In Egypt, he was treated like a living god, and in a moment of high drama, nearly drowned during a journey on the Nile. Everywhere he went, he tied the disparate parts of the empire together through his physical appearances, his thoughtful policies, and his generous architectural patronage. But his favorite stop, the place his heart truly called home, was always Greece. Hadrian absolutely adored Hellenic culture, its language, its philosophy, its art, and its aesthetics. He eagerly participated in the sacred Eleusinian mysteries, he patronized philosophers, and he even earned the nickname Graeculus, the little Greek, in his youth. He wasn't insulted by it. He leaned into it with pride. In his beloved Athens, he financed the completion of the colossal temple of Olympian Zeus, a project that had been abandoned for centuries. He began the construction of the magnificent Library of Hadrian and sought to revive the old Pan-Hellenic League uniting the Greek cities under a shared banner of cultural pride. His travels were never vacations. They were the ultimate form of statecraft. By physically appearing in every corner of his vast empire, Hadrian sent a powerful message to the provinces: you are not forgotten. He wasn't just the emperor back in Rome. He was the emperor on their roads, in their markets, inspecting their temples and sharing their dust. Hadrian didn't just walk the empire. He reimagined it in stone and marble. He was a builder by deep, abiding passion, not just by imperial policy. His reign marked a true golden age of imperial architecture, a time when concrete and marble became the tools of philosophy, of power, and of cultural fusion. Wherever he went, Hadrian left behind a legacy of arches, aqueducts, baths, theaters, and temples, not just as sterile monuments, but as living blueprints for a unified and stable empire. Perhaps his most iconic and breathtaking contribution within the city of Rome itself was the Pantheon, which was completely rebuilt under his orders around 126 CE. While the earlier version, built by Agrippa, had burned down, Hadrian's incredible vision transformed it into one of the most enduring and influential buildings in all of human history. With its massive coffered concrete dome and its famous oculus, the single open eye to the heavens, the Pantheon became an absolute marvel of Roman engineering and a powerful symbol of the heavens touching the earth. It was at once religious, geometric, cosmic, and deeply unmistakably Hadrianic. Then there was his sprawling villa at Tivoli, a vast and complex estate built east of Rome that became both his personal retreat and his architectural laboratory. Unlike typical imperial villas, Hadrian's estate was something entirely new, a curated architectural portfolio of his travels. It replicated famous and beloved landmarks from all across the empire. There were Egyptian colonnades, Greek stoas, and even a miniature canal system modeled on the Nile. This wasn't just a villa. It was a philosopher king's dreamscape, brought to life a powerful statement that Rome encompassed all worlds within it. Across the provinces, he launched absolutely massive infrastructure campaigns. In his beloved Athens, he finally completed the Temple of Olympian Zeus, a gargantuan project that had been left abandoned for centuries. In North Africa, he funded the construction of roads, aqueducts, and granaries that were essential to the empire's food supply. In Asia Minor and the Levant, he rebuilt entire cities that had been ravaged by earthquakes. In Jerusalem, in a move that would prove to be deeply controversial, he refounded the city as a Roman colony named Aelia Capitolina, an act of Romanization that sparked outrage among the Jewish population and would have devastating consequences later on. Hadrian's architectural style was as eclectic and worldly as his travels. He loved the powerful Roman forms of arches, symmetry, and domes. But he also masterfully incorporated the elegant aesthetics of Greece, the mysterious motifs of Egypt, and the practical utility of local materials. He didn't just force a rigid Roman identity on the provinces. He brilliantly wove their own traditions into the imperial fabric. For Hadrian, architecture wasn't just about utility or beauty. It was a philosophy written in stone, a silent and enduring way of saying, Rome is not just a place. It is an idea, and this is what that idea looks like. Through bricks and mortar, Hadrian didn't just preserve the empire. He defined its very soul. Among the many, many people who walked beside the Emperor Hadrian during his endless travels, none would leave a deeper or more lasting emotional imprint than Antinous, a beautiful young man from Bithynia in Asia Minor. Their relationship, which was tender, deeply controversial, and ultimately tragic, would come to shape the emperor's personal mythology and produce one of the most unusual and fascinating cults in all of Roman history. Antinous first appears in Hadrian's life around the year 124 CE, likely as a handsome teenage companion. He is described in the ancient sources as being stunningly beautiful, quiet, and obedient. He quickly became Hadrian's undisputed favorite, accompanying him on his journeys throughout the empire, especially during their time in Greece and Egypt. Their relationship, while never officially defined, was widely understood to be romantic. In a society where emperors often wielded absolute and predatory power over their courtly relationships, Hadrian's bond with Antinous stood out for its visible intensity and its apparent depth of feeling. But in the year 130 CE, while they were sailing along the majestic Nile River, tragedy struck. Antinous drowned under deeply mysterious circumstances. The details are frustratingly vague, lost to the river of time. Some ancient sources say it was a tragic accident. Others whisper of a dark ritual sacrifice, perhaps to prolong the emperor's life. And still others suggest it was a selfless act of suicide. Whatever the truth may be, Hadrian was absolutely, completely, and inconsolably devastated. He openly mourned his young companion in ways that no Roman emperor ever had before. His grief was not hidden away. It was public, it was passionate, and it was enduring. What followed this tragedy was one of the most extraordinary acts of imperial memorial in all of history. Hadrian refused to let his beloved be forgotten. He deified Antinous. He founded an entire city near the site of his death, which he named Antinoopolis, and he established official cults in his honor all throughout the empire. Statues of the young man were commissioned by the hundreds, transforming him into one of the most recognizable faces from the ancient world. His image, always idealized, serene, and hauntingly beautiful, became a new icon of youthful beauty and divine potential. Temples were built, coins were minted, grand festivals were held, and even oracles were established, all devoted to the memory of Antinous. In many ways, he became a kind of pagan saint, a gentle god of grief, of rebirth, and of idealized male beauty. No imperial lover before or since had ever been honored in such a spectacular fashion. And for Hadrian, this was clearly not just political theater. This was his own personal mythology, a story of love and loss written in stone and marble across 3 continents. The cult of Antinous persisted long after Hadrian's death. His serene statues outlived empires. His name echoed in the writings of poets and travelers for centuries. Through Antinous, Hadrian didn't just immortalize a lost love. He profoundly and permanently challenged the entire empire's understanding of what and who could be divine. Hadrian's magnificent reign, though so often and so rightly marked by breathtaking art, profound philosophy, and restless travel, was not without its moments of fire, and none burned hotter or more tragically than the Bar Kokhba revolt. This was the most violent and desperate Jewish uprising against Roman rule, a bloody conflict that would test the emperor's famous patience to its absolute limit, reveal his hidden and ruthless streak, and leave deep, permanent scars on the ancient province of Judea. This was not a story of architecture. It was a story of annihilation. What could have caused such a catastrophe? The seeds of this terrible rebellion were sown when Hadrian, in a grand but tragically misguided effort to unify his diverse empire under a common Roman civic religion, attempted to refound the holy city of Jerusalem as a Roman colony. He planned to name it Ia Capitolina, after his own family name, Aelius, and dedicate it to the king of the Roman gods, Jupiter Capitolinus. Can you even begin to imagine the horror and outrage this caused? To make matters infinitely worse, he reportedly planned to build a magnificent new temple to Jupiter directly on the hallowed ruins of the Second Temple, the absolute holiest site in all of Judaism. Whether this was an act of breathtaking cultural insensitivity or a deliberate political provocation, it was seen by the Jewish population as nothing less than the ultimate sacrilege. It was a declaration of war on their very soul. And so, in the year 132, CE rebellion erupted like a volcano. The uprising was led by a man named Simon bar Kokhba, a charismatic, powerful, and fiercely militant figure who was hailed by some of his followers as the long-awaited Messiah. His forces, fueled by righteous fury, quickly overwhelmed the stunned Roman garrisons in the region. In a shocking victory, they retook Jerusalem and managed to establish a short-lived independent Jewish state. For 2 incredible defiant years, Bar Kokhba ruled as a de facto prince, minting his own coins as a symbol of sovereignty and enforcing Jewish law across the land he had liberated. It was a fleeting moment of impossible hope. Hadrian, who was traveling in the east at the time, was initially caught completely off guard by the scale and success of the revolt. His response, however, was not one of panic, but of cold, calculated, strategic fury. This was the philosopher king pushed to the brink, and the result was terrifying. He summoned his very best generals, including the formidable Julius Severus, who was recalled all the way from his post in Britain. He amassed an overwhelming military force, legion after legion, drawn from across the empire. And what followed was not a battle, but a brutal, systematic counterinsurgency campaign. Roman troops crushed village after village, deploying scorched earth tactics that turned fertile lands into barren ash. They used relentless siege warfare to starve out rebel strongholds and carried out mass executions on a horrifying scale. No mercy was shown, not to the rebels, and not to the civilians who were merely suspected of aiding them. The humanist emperor was gone. Only the wrath of Rome remained. By the year 135 CE, the revolt was over. Bar Kokhba was dead, his dream of a free Judea extinguished in blood and fire. The entire province was utterly devastated. According to the Roman historian Cassius Dio, over 500,000 Jews were killed in the fighting, and countless others were sold into slavery and scattered across the empire. In a final cruel act of erasure, Hadrian officially renamed the province of Judea to Syria. Palestina, a deliberate and cynical move to sever the ancient Jewish ties to the land. Jewish religious practices were severely restricted, and the surviving population was left broken and exiled. Hadrian, once the celebrated emperor of architecture and elegance, had shown the world his iron fist. His rule over Judea remains one of the darkest and most tragic chapters of his entire reign. A chapter marked not by beautiful roads or magnificent domes, but by fire, ashes, and the bitterness of exile. It was a harsh and terrible reminder to the entire world. Hadrian could love books, gods, and boys with all his heart, but if he was challenged, he would rule with unyielding Roman steel. After so many years of restless travel of monumental construction and of practicing both delicate diplomacy and unimaginable brutality, the Emperor Hadrian began to slow down. The final phase of his remarkable life was marked by creeping illness, a profound and unshakable melancholy, and the deepening, humbling sense that even the most powerful emperors cannot master their own mortality. The very man who had once walked the entire empire in a pair of simple sandals now rarely left the splendid isolation of his villa. The philosopher king, the master of the world, grew increasingly reclusive, irritable, and morbid. By the year 133 CE, Hadrian was suffering terribly from a chronic illness, likely a form of congestive heart disease or kidney failure, based on ancient descriptions of his bloating, his weakness, and his agonizing difficulty in breathing. The man who had reshaped the world felt his own body betraying him. He grew depressed and became obsessed with his own impending death. It was during this time that he began composing poetry about mortality verses that were often bleak, beautiful, and deeply introspective. One of his most famous and haunting verses is a whispered, poignant farewell to his own soul. Animula vagula blandula, little soul wandering, fleeting one. A heartbreaking reflection on the fragility of life and the ultimate limits of imperial power. But even as his body failed him, he still had one final critical imperial duty to perform. He had to name a successor. Who could possibly follow him? Hadrian had no biological children of his own, and it seems his sharp political instincts were clouded by a strange mix of personal affection and desperation. In the year 136 CE, he made a shocking choice. He adopted Lucius Caeonius Commodus, who then became known as Lucius Aelius Caesar. He was a relatively obscure senator with a reputation for immense charm, but notoriously poor health. Many in the Roman elite were completely puzzled by this decision. The man was stylish, yes, perhaps even soft, and he was clearly not built to rule the vast Roman Empire. Their doubts, it turned out, were justified. Just a few months after his adoption, Aelius died suddenly, probably from a bout of tuberculosis. Hadrian was said to be devastated, and now he was once again scrambling to find a suitable heir to prevent a civil war. With time rapidly running out, he turned to a much more traditional and stable choice, a respected, moderate, and universally admired senator named Titus Aurelius Antoninus. In 138 CE, Hadrian officially adopted Antoninus as his son and heir, but he did so with a brilliant forward-thinking twist. He demanded that Antoninus in turn must immediately adopt two sons of his own, the young man who would later become the legendary philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius and the younger Lucius Verus. In this single masterful act of political engineering, Hadrian effectively secured the next two generations of stable, competent leadership for the empire. It was his final great gift to Rome. But this act of foresight didn't ease his personal suffering. He retreated to his beloved sprawling villa at Tivoli, where he spent his final agonizing days surrounded by the beautiful memories of his travels, the silent company of his sculptures, and surely the ever-present ghost of his lost love, Antinous. As his condition worsened and the pain became unbearable, it is said that he attempted to take his own life multiple times, only to be prevented by his loyal attendants, who could not bear to see him go. His death finally came in July of 138 CE at the age of 62. Hadrian's ashes were placed in the magnificent mausoleum he had built for himself, a towering cylindrical tomb on the banks of the Tiber, a structure that would later become the famous Castel Sant'Angelo. When the Emperor Hadrian died in 138 CE, he left behind no newly expanded empire, but one that was far more secure, far more cohesive, and far more intellectually vibrant than the one he had found. His reign was not defined by glorious conquest, like that of his predecessor Trajan, but by the patient and wise act of consolidation. And that, in hindsight, was a truly revolutionary act. In an age that was completely obsessed with the pursuit of outward glory and endless expansion, Hadrian possessed the rare clarity and the sheer audacity to look inward. The most visible reminders of his incredible rule still stand today, bearing silent witness to his vision. Hadrian's Wall, stretching like a stone spine across the green hills of northern Britain, became a powerful symbol of imperial strength achieved not through aggression, but through the wisdom of boundaries. It was a definitive statement that said, "This is Rome, and that is not." It wasn't just a military fortification, it was a philosophical declaration. The empire, he declared, had limits, and knowing those limits was the very definition of wisdom. In the capital, his breathtaking reconstruction of the Pantheon forever changed the course of architectural history. Its vast, unsupported dome is still to this day the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the entire world. What an achievement! It was a temple built not just to honor the gods, but as a testament to the limitless possibility of Roman engineering and imagination. It is the physical embodiment of Hadrian's own intellect. It is precise, it is timeless, and it is forever open to the sky. And his magnificent villa at Tivoli, with its sprawling libraries, its serene water gardens, and its recreated temples from across the world, became the inspirational model for the grand Renaissance palaces built centuries later. It was nothing less than Hadrian's dream of the world, an entire empire reduced to the scale of art and landscape. But Hadrian's legacy wasn't only made of stone and mortar. It was also deeply etched in policy and in precedent. He reformed and codified Roman law, making it more equitable. He reorganized the military, keeping it sharp and ready without the need for constant draining warfare. He professionalized the provincial administration, making the governance of the empire more efficient and just. He visited his provinces not to dazzle them with imperial splendor, but to truly understand them, leaving behind a revolutionary new model of imperial responsibility. Culturally, his passionate love of Greek philosophy, poetry, and sculpture helped to spark a brilliant revival of Hellenic traditions all across the Roman world. The very man who was once mocked as Graiculus, the little Greek had in effect re-Hellenized the entire empire, not by force, but by the sheer power of his taste. And politically, Hadrian's final brilliant choice of Antoninus Pius and the required adoption of Marcus Aurelius ensured an unprecedented period of peace and prosperity that would later be called the Pax Antonina. His incredible foresight birthed the era of the so-called Five Good Emperors, a run of stability and justice that was unmatched in all of Roman history. Yet, he will always remain a paradox. How can one man be so many things? He was a builder who destroyed an entire province in Judea. He was a lover of peace who possessed a hidden and terrifying iron fist. He was a student of beauty who governed with cold, hard realism. Hadrian's Rome wasn't just about marble and might. It was about mind memory and measure. Hadrian didn't just rule Rome. He completely reimagined what it meant to be an emperor. His incredible reign stands at the crossroads of military command and philosophical inquiry, of sacred tradition and bold reinvention. In so many ways, Hadrian marked a critical turning point in history the very moment the Roman emperor stopped being merely a warlord-in-chief and became instead a curator of civilization. Unlike his predecessors, Hadrian projected his power through his presence rather than through his expansion. By walking the roads of his empire, visiting the garrisons, inspecting the aqueducts, and debating with the local philosophers, he transformed the very nature of emperorship into a grand performance of omnipresent responsibility. The toga and the scroll under Hadrian became just as essential to imperial power as the sword and the shield. This profound shift heavily influenced how future emperors would see their role. His immediate successors, Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius, fully embraced this vision. They ruled not as conquerors, but as dedicated stewards of Roman order focused on justice, infrastructure, and cultural refinement. It's fair to say that Marcus Aurelius, with his deeply personal and philosophical meditations, might never have emerged had Hadrian not first elevated philosophy into a legitimate imperial pursuit. Hadrian also fully embodied the inherent paradoxes of absolute power. He was both adored and feared elegant, and yet shockingly cruel when provoked. His reign was a period of relative calm for the empire, but beneath that calm surface lay authoritarian reflexes. The summary executions of the senators at the start of his reign, the brutal crushing of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the quiet exile of dissenters. These acts revealed a man who preached moderation, but who wielded his authority with surgical and terrifying ruthlessness when he was challenged. Privately, Hadrian was deeply introspective and melancholic. His poetry, especially late in his life, reveals a man who was acutely aware of his own mortality and his own contradictions. His intense love for Antinous, a love that was idealized, deified, and mourned with such public passion, offered a startling emotional counterweight to his stoic public image. That raw, unfiltered grief made him human, and it echoes through the centuries as a rare and touching moment of imperial vulnerability. Even in his death, Hadrian crafted a legacy of enduring presence. His massive mausoleum, now Rome's Castel Sant'Angelo, stands like a fortress against the act of forgetting. His buildings still define the skylines of ancient cities. His laws informed the legal systems of generations to come. His travels stitched together a fragile multicultural empire into something that, at least for a brief and shining moment, felt truly united. Hadrian's greatness then lies not in what he conquered, but in what he conserved, what he built, and what he imagined. He was a living paradox with a laurel crown. He was an architect and an autocrat, a poet and an emperor, a human and an enigma. In the end, Hadrian didn't just leave behind monuments of stone. He left behind a new model of emperorship itself, one that still haunts the magnificent ruins of Rome and the minds of all who walk among them. And now, let us leap across the ocean and forward in time to a new republic grappling with its own destiny. In the year 1803, President Thomas Jefferson, with the simple stroke of a pen, doubled the size of the United States. Can you believe it? The Louisiana Purchase, a staggering $15 million deal, with Napoleonic France added over 800,000 square miles of mostly uncharted wilderness to the young republic. It was a geopolitical coup of epic proportions, but it was also a massive continent-sized cartographic question mark. What exactly had America just bought? Were there mountains, deserts, great water, routes to the sea? Were there monsters? Jefferson had absolutely no clue, but he was a man of the Enlightenment, and he was absolutely determined to find out. Enter Meriwether Lewis, Jefferson's own personal secretary, and a man with an insatiable appetite for both high adventure and meticulously kept scientific notebooks. Jefferson handpicked him to lead a daring expedition to explore this vast new territory, to map its geography, to document its flora and fauna, and most importantly, to determine if a water route to the Pacific Ocean, the mythical long-sought Northwest Passage, actually existed. But Lewis wasn't going to go alone. He chose his old friend and trusted military comrade William Clark to be his co-leader. This was a stroke of genius. While Lewis had a brilliant mind for science, botany, and diplomacy, Clark brought a soldier's discipline, a master's skill in cartography, and an easy, natural rapport with men. It was a perfect balance that Jefferson believed was essential for the mission's success. They would be equal leaders, a true partnership, despite the fact that only Lewis held a formal commission from the president. Their unshakable unity would become one of the expedition's greatest and most defining strengths. Preparations began immediately. Jefferson provided them with incredibly detailed instructions. Observe the landscape with a scientific eye. Establish peaceful trade with the native tribes you encounter. Study all new forms of plant and animal life and assert an American presence in these lands that were already occupied by dozens of powerful indigenous nations. It was a mission of subtle diplomacy wrapped in the noble guise of scientific curiosity. Supplies were painstakingly gathered. Compasses, sextants, microscopes, and of course gifts for the native leaders like colorful beads, mirrors, and silver peace medals bearing the president's likeness. They even brought a collapsible iron frame boat, a marvel of ingenuity, that unfortunately never quite worked, but must have looked great on paper. Dozens of rugged, brave men were recruited mostly from the U.S. Army. This hardy group would become the legendary Corps of Discovery, a name every bit as ambitious as the journey itself. The expedition officially launched from Camp Dubois near St. Louis in May of 1804. What lay ahead of them? Thousands of miles of completely unknown terrain, countless tribal nations, whose intentions were a mystery and a daunting mission with absolutely no guarantee of return. But for Jefferson, and for Lewis and Clark, the prize wasn't just about land. It was about knowledge. The kind of knowledge that would transform America's future and define its rugged, adventurous frontier spirit. And so, with their maps still unwritten and their journals still blank, the Corps of Discovery set off into the great American wilderness, chasing a grand vision that was at that point only barely glimpsed through the powerful dreams of Thomas Jefferson. On May 14, 1804, the Corps of Discovery officially pushed off from the muddy banks of the Missouri River, beginning what would become a grueling 2-year odyssey into lands that few Americans had ever seen. Their departure was remarkably quiet and unceremonious. There were no grand parades, no cheering crowds to see them off, just a determined group of 33 men in a 55-foot keelboat and 2 smaller pirogues hauling nearly 10 tons of supplies upstream and into the wild. Their progress was painfully, agonizingly slow. The Missouri River, while their main highway westward, was a deceptively treacherous and powerful beast. Constantly shifting sandbars, immensely powerful currents, and dense fallen trees called sawyers made travel a daily back-breaking grind. The men used long poles, heavy ropes, oars, and sheer bloody-minded will to inch their heavy boats forward against the relentless flow. At times it must have felt like they were trying to row through wet cement. The crew was a motley collection of hardened frontiersmen, expert hunters, French-Canadian boatmen, and a few soldiers with more grit than polish. Among them were some notable figures like York Clark's enslaved servant, whose large size, incredible strength, and dark skin would later earn him deep respect, and a kind of celebrity status among the native tribes. And there was also Charles Floyd, a young sergeant whose tragic fate would soon remind them all just how fragile life on the frontier could be. The team quickly fell into a disciplined military-style routine. Clark, ever the meticulous cartographer, spent his days mapping every single bend and twist in the river. Lewis, the passionate naturalist, cataloged new species of flora and fauna, collecting samples and describing everything from catfish to coyotes to the swarms of mosquitoes with an obsessive scientific detail. Every single day they encountered new creatures, some of them majestic, like bald eagles and massive herds of elk, and others decidedly less welcome. Gnats, ticks, and biting flies became a form of daily maddening torture. By the late summer, they had reached the lands of what is now Iowa and South Dakota, where the landscape transformed into vast, sweeping prairies under an endless sky. It was here that they had their first significant diplomatic meetings with the native tribes, including the Oto and the Missouri, and later the powerful Teton Sioux. These initial encounters were incredibly tense and fraught with danger. Lewis and Clark carried their peace medals and their American flags, which were meant to be symbols of goodwill, but were also unmistakable symbols of power. The message was clear: if unspoken, a new nation had arrived in these lands, and it intended to be known. Still, a palpable mistrust simmered just beneath the surface of the formal smiles and exchanged gifts. The expedition was often desperately outnumbered and outgunned. Diplomacy for them wasn't just an option, it was the key to their very survival. A single misstep, a single misunderstanding could spell absolute disaster. Yet through a combination of brute strength, unwavering cooperation, and incredibly careful tact, the Corps continued to push their way upriver. They hadn't even reached their first winter yet, but the tone of the entire expedition was already set. This journey would demand unimaginable endurance, profound humility, and nerves of absolute steel. And the Missouri River, she was just getting warmed up. By the time the autumn of 1804 crept almost silently across the Great Plains, dusting the vast grasslands with a hint of gold, the mighty Missouri River had begun to slow, growing heavy and sluggish under the immense weight of the coming freeze. The Corps of Discovery had already traveled over 1,000 grueling miles from St. Louis, and they knew with the chilling certainty of experienced frontiersmen that they would never make it to the towering Rocky Mountains before the snow sealed the way west like a tomb. It was time to pause. It was time to regroup. It was time to survive. They chose a spot near what is now Washburn, North Dakota, settling in just downstream from a bustling cluster of Mandan and Hidatsa villages. These were not the nomadic tribes of the open plains. These native communities had long ago established impressive permanent settlements of large, sturdy earth lodges right along the riverbanks. Their societies were agriculturally rich, socially sophisticated, and strategically placed at the very crossroads of regional trade. The Mandan people were already seasoned and savvy diplomats, having hosted French, British, and Spanish traders for decades. The Americans. They were just the latest strangers to arrive with strange hats and even stranger intentions. Here in the shadow of these established communities, Lewis and Clark ordered their exhausted men to build a winter fort, which they named Fort Mandan, in a gesture of honor toward their new hosts. It rose from the frozen, unforgiving prairie like a raw wooden statement of intent. We are here, it seemed to say, and we are here to stay, at least until the spring thaw releases us. Constructed of heavy cottonwood logs, the fort featured high defensive walls, blockhouses at the corners, and a series of cramped, smoky rooms for over 30 weary men. It was far more drafty than it was comfortable, but it managed to keep the howling, soul-stealing Dakota winds at bay, and those winds, my friends, were absolutely merciless. Temperatures often plunged far below 0 Fahrenheit, a cold so profound it felt like a physical weight. Frostbite wasn't just a risk, it was a daily menacing threat that nibbled at fingers and toes. Yet life inside the chilly confines of Fort Mandan was far from idle. Lewis and Clark were men possessed by a mission obsessively recording mountains of data, everything from daily temperature readings and the vocabulary of tribal languages to the exact number of corn kernels on a local cob. And crucially, it was here at Fort Mandan that they met two people who would change the entire course of the expedition. They met Toussaint Charbonneau, a middling French-Canadian fur trapper, and his young, pregnant Shoshone wife, a woman named Sacagawea. Though Charbonneau was officially hired to serve as a translator, it was Sacagawea who would become an absolutely indispensable guide diplomat and symbol in the difficult months that lay ahead. Her intimate knowledge of the Western geography and her incredible ability to communicate with the native tribes they would soon encounter would prove to be far more valuable than any musket map or compass. Their relations with the Mandan were mostly peaceful, a delicate dance of trade and curiosity, though tensions did occasionally rise to the surface. How could they not? Cultural misunderstandings, the scarcity of resources in the brutal winter, and the sheer unavoidable friction of proximity made conflict almost inevitable. Still, the Corps knew with absolute certainty that without the cooperation and tolerance of their native hosts, their grand mission could very well end right there, buried in a frozen North Dakota snowdrift. By the spring of 1805, with their journals full of priceless information, their gear repaired, and Sacagawea's newborn son Jean-Baptiste, swaddled and ready for the journey, the Corps of Discovery dismantled Fort Mandan. The next phase of their epic journey, the great leap into the vast unknown that lay beyond the plains and toward the formidable Rockies, was about to begin. The world was about to crack open for them. In the crisp air of April 1805, the Corps of Discovery left behind the relative safety and monotony of Fort Mandan and re-entered the unpredictable, untamed wild. They now traveled lighter with a smaller party and a renewed sense of urgency. The long frozen lull of winter was finally over. What lay ahead? Mountains that scraped the sky, uncharted rivers that roared with power, and the single haunting question that drove Jefferson's grand plan. Was there a continuous water route to the Pacific Ocean, spring on the upper Missouri, brought breathtaking beauty, but it also brought a living, breathing, blood-sucking torment. The riverbanks and prairies teemed with clouds of mosquitoes which harassed the men with a relentless, maddening ferocity. Their sleep was constantly interrupted by whining, biting swarms. Yes, the game, bison, deer, and bear became more plentiful, a welcome relief from the winter diet, but so too did the miseries of blistering sunburn, painfully swollen insect bites, and a suffocating damp humidity. Lewis, ever the scientist, noted it all in his journal, his tone somewhere between detached scientific curiosity and mild, weary suffering. It was during this very stretch of the river that the expedition experienced its first terrifying near disaster. While attempting to navigate a sudden squall, one of their pirogues capsized, threatening to dump months of priceless records and instruments into the churning river. While men panicked, it was Sacagawea who, with her baby strapped to her back, calmly and methodically rescued the most critical items, including Clark's irreplaceable journals and maps. This single act of cool-headed bravery earned her an even deeper, more profound respect from the men. She wasn't just a translator or a guide anymore. She was a stabilizing force, the calm eye in their chaotic storm, a woman who was adaptable, resilient, and fiercely capable. By June, the Corps reached the magnificent Great Falls of the Missouri, which turned out not to be one waterfall, but a stunning series of 5 massive falls stretching across 18 grueling miles. It was a magnificent natural wonder, a sight of awesome power and beauty, and it was an absolute unmitigated nightmare to portage. Can you even imagine the task? The men spent nearly a whole month hauling their heavy boats and tons of supplies overland around steep, crumbling cliffs and across jagged, cactus-strewn terrain. They used crudely made carts that constantly broke down and relied on sheer brute strength to inch their cargo forward. Some of the men would later call it the single most physically grueling challenge of the entire 2-year journey. Still, their spirits lifted when Lewis finally spotted the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains, shimmering in the distant haze. That glorious moment, though incredibly inspiring, also brought with it a cold spike of dread. The team had naively assumed the Rockies would be like the gentle rolling Appalachians back east. They were not. These were monstrous, jagged peaks that would soon dash all of their hopes of finding a continuous, easy river route to the Pacific. But just as despair began to set in, hope came in the most unlikely of forms. It came in the form of Sacagawea's own people, the Shoshone. When the Corps finally made contact with them, an absolutely astonishing reunion unfolded, a moment so perfect it feels like it was plucked from a legend. The chief of this Shoshone band, a man named Kamiawait, turned out to be Sacagawea's long-lost brother. Can you believe the odds? That single moment, an equal parts miracle of luck and destiny, shifted everything. Overjoyed to be reunited with his sister, the Shoshone agreed to provide the expedition with the horses, the supplies, and the guides that were absolutely crucial for them to cross the impassable Bitterroot Mountains, a place where no boat could ever go. The mighty Missouri had taken them as far as it could. Now the real climb was about to begin. Crossing the Rocky Mountains was never going to be easy, but even the most pessimistic, hard-bitten predictions from the men couldn't have possibly prepared the Corps of Discovery for the brutal, soul-crushing reality of the Bitterroot Range. With the Missouri River now far behind them, and the Pacific Ocean still a distant, hazy dream, the expedition now had to abandon their trusty boats and march onward on horseback, hauling what little gear they could over narrow, treacherous, and icy trails. Armed with the precious Shoshone horses and their guides, the Corps began their desperate trek across the Bitterroot Mountains in early September of 1805. The terrain was utterly merciless. It was a world of jagged ridges that tore at their clothes, steep, shadowy ravines, and thick, dark forests that made every single step a grueling battle. The trails were often nothing more than faint game paths that wound precariously through dense fog, early snow, and wind-blasted mountain passes. But the worst enemy, the one that truly broke them down, was hunger. The game was nearly non-existent in these high, desolate places. The men, pushed to the absolute brink of starvation, resorted to eating their tallow candles, a thin, disgusting soup made from rendered bear fat, and eventually the very horses that carried them. The journals from this period become haunted by the specter of food. They are reduced to grim, desperate catalogues of what was edible and what was simply an act of pure desperation. Men collapsed from exhaustion. their moccasins completely disintegrated on the sharp rocks. Frostbite crept like a silent predator into their fingers and toes. One of the most harrowing sections of this crossing was Lolo Pass, where the starving party trudged through deep snowdrifts while gnawing on boiled roots and strips of shredded rawhide. Clark wrote in his journal that they were entirely out of provisions and subsisting on horse meat. It was quite simply the lowest physical and psychological point of the entire journey. It was a vision of hell. And yet somehow they didn't give up. They pushed on. When they finally emerged from the other side of the mountains near present-day Idaho, the Corps stumbled like ghosts into the lands of the Nez Perce tribe. The Nez Perce warriors could have easily wiped out the starved, weakened, and pathetic-looking group of strangers, but instead, in an act of incredible grace, they nursed the starving men back to health. They offered them dried fish and camas root, and they even helped them construct new canoes so they could continue their journey west by river. It was another miraculous turn of fate, another powerful reminder that it was indigenous hospitality, not just American grit, that made this expedition possible. While they rested and regained their strength with the Nez Perce Lewis and Clark reflected on what still lay ahead. They were battered, they were frostbitten, and they were deeply malnourished. But now, for the first time, they were within reach of the great Columbia River Basin, and that meant only one thing: the Pacific Ocean was near. But the worst they knew wasn't over yet. The rivers ahead were wild, the weather was unpredictable, and the icy grip of winter was close behind. With the formidable Rocky Mountains finally behind them and the cold breath of winter closing in, the Corps of Discovery began the arduous task of building new dugout canoes from towering ponderosa pines, a skill they learned thanks to the generous assistance of the Nez Perce. Their next target was the Columbia River, the mighty waterway that would, they prayed, carry them westward toward the Pacific Ocean, the long-awaited end of their painful cross-continental march. But if they thought that paddling downstream would be easier than crossing the mountains, they were in for a wet, cold, and violent surprise. The Columbia was no lazy, meandering river. It was fast, it was rocky, it was incredibly moody, and at times it seemed to actively fight their very existence. The new canoes were heavy and often unstable, especially when loaded with the full weight of their gear. Their precious journals, their scientific specimens, and the sheer human exhaustion of the crew. Treacherous boiling rapids constantly threatened to flip their boats and drown their precious cargo. More than once, men were thrown into the icy water and nearly died. Only their quick reflexes and a healthy dose of sheer dumb luck kept the expedition from losing everything. Along the way, they encountered several Chinookan and Sahaptin-speaking tribes whose societies were rich in trade, especially in salmon, a staple food that swam in the rivers in almost impossible abundance. The Corps marveled at their expert fishing methods, their impressive carved plank houses, and their sleek, detailed canoes. These tribes were savvy. They were experienced traders, and they were understandably wary of these pale-faced newcomers. Diplomacy once again remained a delicate and constant tightrope walk. Some tribes welcomed the strangers with curiosity. Others viewed them as unwanted intruders inching ever closer to their world. The farther west they traveled, the more the environment transformed. Rain began to fall with a merciless, dreary regularity. The lush, temperate rainforests of what is now Washington and Oregon were hauntingly beautiful, but they were also cold, perpetually damp, and utterly relentless. The men's leather clothing began to mold and rot right off their bodies. Their gunpowder became unreliable. The journals of Lewis and Clark during this period read like diaries from a soggy green purgatory. Finally, in the middle of November 1805, after 18 long months of unimaginable hardship, the Corps reached the mouth of the Columbia River, and there, through the gray, stormy, ever-present mist, they caught their first long-awaited glimpse of the Pacific Ocean. The moment should have been triumphant, a scene of epic celebration, but it was anything but romantic. Their camp, which they hastily constructed near what is now Astoria, Oregon, was a muddy, wind-swept mess of wind and despair. They named the dreary site Fort Clatsop. And they would spend a long, wet, miserable winter there, feeling cold, getting sick, and being perpetually plagued by fleas. How did they pass the time? They spent their days making new moccasins, boiling stringy elk meat, and writing page after dreary page in their journals. They had made it. They had reached the ocean. But now the hardest and most daunting truth of all stared them down. They still had to go all the way back. Reaching the Pacific Ocean in November of 1805 should have marked a glorious victory lap for the Corps of Discovery. But the ocean, it seemed, was not in a festive mood. Torrential, bone-chilling rain, freezing temperatures, and relentless coastal storms turned their long-sought reward into a damp, muddy, and miserable nightmare. There was no glory here, only survival. With little choice, the expedition built a crude, rough-hewn shelter on the south side of the Columbia River, naming it Fort Clatsop, after the local Clatsop tribe. The winter of 1805 to 1806 was, in a word, brutal. According to Clark's meticulous notes, it rained every single day except for 12. The men's clothing rotted on their backs. Lice and fleas ran rampant through the damp fort, and the dreaded specter of scurvy loomed over them. Elk, their primary food source, had to be hunted daily, often miles from the miserable camp through thick, wet forest. The meat they brought back was tough, incredibly lean, and barely enough to keep body and morale from completely collapsing. Yet despite the profound discomfort and misery, Lewis and Clark insisted on the continuation of their mission. The documentation had to go on. They painstakingly detailed tribal customs, the local geography, the miserable weather, and the strange new plants and animals of the Pacific coast, adding hundreds of more pages to the scientific record of their journey. Lewis meticulously described the playful sea otters, while Clark, ever the cartographer, improved the maps that would one day guide generations of American settlers westward. Even in the depths of their misery, they remained obsessive, dedicated observers. Their interactions with the local tribes were mixed and often tense. The Clatsop and Chinook peoples were accomplished and shrewd traders with long-standing complex networks that ran up and down the coast. They were polite enough, but they were not particularly enthusiastic about the Corps' prolonged presence. Negotiations over food or supplies often involved stern, hard bargaining, not the friendly hospitality they had experienced with the Mandan or the Nez Perce. Unlike those inland tribes, these coastal peoples expected fair and equal reciprocity, and they didn't mind showing their impatience when the Americans offered them less than impressive trade goods. And then there was the boredom. My God, the boredom. Trapped in a leaky fort made of soggy logs, just waiting and waiting for the miserable weather to break. The men passed the long, dark, dreary days making salt by boiling seawater, mending their rotting clothes, and carving little wooden souvenirs. Spirits ran dangerously low. Illness spread through the camp. Even Lewis, who was usually the steely-eyed, unflappable scientist, grew irritable, moody, and withdrawn. By March of 1806, the Corps had had more than enough. With their journals overflowing with data, their biological samples preserved as best they could, and their bodies feeling perpetually damp and stiff from months of unrelenting hardship, they burned their candles for the last time at Fort Clatsop, packed what little they had that hadn't completely rotted away, and turned their faces eastward toward home. They had found the Pacific. They had touched the western edge of the continent. Now came the real test, surviving the long, punishing return to civilization, but this time without the thrilling awe of the unknown, to pull them forward only the painful memory of every single step that lay ahead. In March of 1806, the Corps of Discovery left the miserable confines of Fort Clatsop, with soaked clothing, exhausted bodies, and one singular burning goal: get home. They had accomplished what no other Americans had ever done, reaching the Pacific Ocean overland. But the journey back, they would soon find, would prove to be just as perilous, just as draining, and in some ways even more complex than the journey out. The wilderness they had once entered with such wide-eyed curiosity now loomed with a different kind of energy. It was familiar, yes, but it was still just as unforgiving. They retraced their steps up the mighty Columbia River, struggling once again with the high currents, the steep cliffs, and a series of tense, difficult interactions with the native tribes. Their supplies of trade goods were running dangerously low. As a result, trade for food was difficult and often unsuccessful. The Chinook and other coastal tribes had grown even more cautious of them, perhaps sensing correctly that the Americans' presence heralded a great wave of changes that they did not welcome. By late spring, the Corps managed to make it back across the Bitterroot Mountains this time, with better weather and much smarter preparation, though it was still a grueling and painful test of their endurance. When they finally reached the Nez Perce villages, they were welcomed not as strangers, but as old friends. In an incredible act of integrity, the tribe had safely kept their horses for them all winter, just as they had promised, and they once again helped the Corps prepare for the next leg of their long journey. It was then that Lewis and Clark made a bold and risky decision. They would split the expedition into smaller groups in order to explore more of the vast territory on their way home. Lewis would head north toward the Marias River, hoping to map its connection to the Missouri and extend the U.S. territorial claims further north. Clark, meanwhile, would follow the Yellowstone River, charting its course and searching for easier routes through the plains. It was an incredibly risky move. Communication between the separate groups was completely impossible, and Lewis's chosen path turned out to be nearly fatal. In late July, Lewis's small group encountered a party of Blackfeet warriors. The Blackfeet initially appeared to be friendly, but they grew deeply suspicious when they saw the Americans' advanced firearms and trade goods. One tense night around the campfire turned deadly. A skirmish broke out, and 2 Blackfeet men were killed, the only violent deaths directly caused by the expedition during their entire journey. Lewis's party was forced to flee for their lives under the cover of darkness, shaken, wounded, and deeply troubled. Clark's group had a slightly less dramatic return, though it was certainly not without its own share of injuries and terrifying bison stampedes. They built new canoes, were reunited with Sacagawea and her family, and successfully navigated the Yellowstone with relative ease. By August of 1806, the 2 weary groups finally reunited near the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers. The expedition was whole again, but the mood was somber. The initial thrill of discovery had long since passed. Now came the final grinding paddle home. They were tired, they were scarred, but they were alive. By late August of 1806, the familiar current of the Missouri River once again pulled the Corps of Discovery downstream, but this time it was carrying them toward home, not toward mystery. Their bodies were thinner, their buckskin uniforms were in tatters, and their precious journals were swollen with mud-stained, hard-won pages, but they had, against all odds, survived. On September 23, 1806, the expedition finally returned to St. Louis. They were greeted not with the fanfare and parades you might expect, but with stunned, slack-jawed awe. Many of the townspeople had presumed them dead long ago. In just over 2 years, Lewis and Clark had traveled over 8,000 miles. They had crossed towering mountains, navigated roaring, treacherous rivers, made contact with more than 50 different native tribes, and meticulously recorded hundreds of new plant and animal species. They had mapped vast portions of the North American continent with astonishing accuracy, and had established a firm American presence in lands that had long been claimed by indigenous nations, as well as by Britain and Spain. The expedition was immediately hailed as a national triumph. Newspapers celebrated their incredible survival and their amazing discoveries. President Jefferson, who had watched and waited anxiously for any news of their fate, was absolutely elated. Yet despite their newfound heroic status, the fates of Lewis and Clark diverged sharply and tragically after their return. Meriwether Lewis was appointed as the governor of the vast Louisiana territory, but he struggled mightily with depression, alcoholism, and mounting debt. The wilderness had marked him in ways no one could see. Just 3 short years after the expedition's triumphant return in 1809, he died under mysterious circumstances, either by suicide or by murder at a remote inn along the Natchez Trace. His tragic loss cast a long, dark shadow over the very mission he had once led with such brilliant precision and unwavering purpose. William Clark, on the other hand, thrived in the new American West. He became the governor of the Missouri Territory and the superintendent of Indian Affairs, and he remained an influential and powerful voice in the nation's westward expansion for decades to come. In a touching tribute to his fallen friend and partner, he named his firstborn son Meriwether Lewis Clark. And what of Sacagawea and York? Sacagawea returned to the West with her husband and child. Her exact fate is debated by historians, but her symbolic role in the American memory only grew with time cementing her as a legend. York Clark's enslaved servant had become a figure of awe and respect among the native tribes he encountered. But despite his invaluable contributions and the freedom he experienced in the wilderness, Clark refused to grant him his freedom for many, many years after their return, a painful and bitter irony that history would not and should not forget. The expedition's legacy is therefore both heroic and deeply complicated. It triumphantly opened the West to further American exploration, trade, and settlement, but it also laid the groundwork for the tragic displacement of the very native peoples whose lands had been so meticulously mapped without their consent. The story of Lewis and Clark is not just one of survival or discovery. It is a story of profound ambition, of incredible resilience, of inevitable cultural collision, and of the high, often heartbreaking cost of manifest destiny. It reminds us that to explore is human, but to truly understand what's been changed in the process, that, my friends, is the real journey.